The night Clara Whitmore's father gambled her life away, she learned three things: how little she was worth to the world, how loud a room could laugh at her humiliation, and how gold could change hands faster than mercy. When the mountain recluse Silas Boone stepped from the shadows with scars like war paint and eyes that promised nothing, she didn't know if she'd been saved or claimed by something darker. But as cruel hands reached for her and the room held its breath, one truth crystallized: her old life was ending, and whatever came next would be written in blood, snow, and survival. Stay with me through this story of fire and ice, where a woman the world dismissed becomes a legend no one will forget. Drop a like and comment with your city so I can see how far Clara's tale travels across the world. The Rusty Nail Saloon stank of cheap whiskey, cheaper tobacco, and the kind of desperation that pooled in frontier towns when winter squeezed too hard and hope ran too thin. Clara Whitmore stood in the corner shadows, her back pressed against rough-hewn walls, still weeping sap, her fingers twisted white-knuckled in the fabric of her worn wool skirt. Around her, the February cold of 1883 seeped through every crack in Red Hollow's most notorious establishment, but the heat inside, the press of unwashed bodies, the roar of drunken voices, the fever pitch of men gambling away things they couldn't afford to lose, made the air thick enough to choke on. She'd known this moment was coming, had felt it building like a storm on the horizon for months now, ever since her father, Thomas Whitmore, had started looking at her with that particular calculation in his bloodshot eyes, the same look he gave the plow horse before he sold it, the same look he gave her mother's silver locket before it disappeared into a card game and never came home. Clara was 22 years old, plus-sized in a world that prized the delicate strong in ways no one cared to measure, and worth exactly as much as the debts her father owed. "Another hand!" Thomas slammed his empty glass on the poker table, spraying droplets across the green felt. His voice carried that dangerous edge it always got around the fourth drink, loud enough to convince himself he was still in control, slurred enough to prove he wasn't. "Just one more hand, and I'll win it all back." The five men around the table exchanged glances that ranged from pity to predatory interest. Clara recognized most of them. Jacob Miller, who ran the grain supply and charged interest that could break a man's back. Samuel Yates, whose ranch sprawled across half the valley and whose cruelty to his workers was legendary. Thomas Brennan, the blacksmith with hands like ham hocks and a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. Warren Price, a drifter who'd blown into town 3 weeks ago with too much gold and too many questions no one dared ask. And dealing the cards with mechanical precision, Frank Nolan, who owned the Rusty Nail and everything sordid that happened within its walls. "You got nothing left to bet, Tom," Frank said, not unkindly. He was a businessman first, and broke customers were bad for business. "You're into me for $70, into Sam for another $100, unless you got something else to put on the table." Frank's eyes slid past Thomas, landing on Clara like a physical weight. The room's noise didn't stop exactly, but it changed. Conversations dropped to murmurs. Someone at the bar turned to look. The piano player's fingers stumbled over the keys before finding their rhythm again, but now the melody sounded ominous, a soundtrack to something inevitable. "Now, Frank," Thomas started, but his protest was hollow, already defeated. "Your daughter's of marrying age, ain't she?" This came from Samuel Yates, who leaned back in his chair until the wood creaked protest. He was 50 if he was a day, with a face weathered by wind and meanness in equal measure. His first wife had died under mysterious circumstances. His second had run off in the night and was never seen again. "Strong-looking girl, could work a homestead, bear children, worth something to the right man." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to run, but her legs had turned to stone. Wanted to scream, but her voice had abandoned her. This was it then, the moment her worst fears crystallized into reality. "Clara's not for sale," Thomas said, but there was no conviction in it, just the reflexive protest of a man trying to remember what shame felt like. "Everything's for sale, Tom. You taught us that." Yet Jacob Miller pushed his spectacles up his nose, studying Clara like she was livestock at auction. "Question is, what's she worth?" "She's a big girl," Warren Price said, and there was cruel amusement in his voice. "Gonna eat you out of house and home. Need a strong man to handle all that woman." Laughter rippled through the saloon, not kind laughter, but the ugly sound of men who'd found someone weaker to kick. Clara felt heat flood her face, that familiar shame that had dogged her since childhood. Too big. Too much. Taking up too much space in a world that wanted women small and quiet and easily overlooked. "She's sturdy," Thomas said, and Clara heard him trying to spin weakness into virtue, failure into sales pitch. "Works hard, cooks good, keeps a clean house. She'd make some man a fine wife." "I'll take her." Samuel Yates stood up, his chair scraping loud against the floorboards. "Clear your debt to Frank, and I'll take her off your hands. Legal marriage, all proper-like." Clara's stomach lurched. Samuel Yates. The man who'd buried 2 wives and worked his ranch hands until they broke. The man whose eyes were always cold, even when he smiled. "Sam, that's generous, but—" Thomas hesitated, and Clara hated that she could see him calculating, weighing his love for his daughter against his desperation to escape his debts. But nothing. Yates pulled out a leather purse, counted out bills onto the table. 70 to Frank, 100 to me makes us even. Another 30 because I'm feeling charitable. That's $200, Tom. More than you've seen in months. All you gotta do is sign over the girl. The silence that fell over the rusty nail was absolute. Even the piano had stopped. Claire could hear her own heartbeat, thunderous in her ears, could hear the crackle of the fire in the potbelly stove, could hear the Montana wind howling outside like it was mourning what was about to happen. "Daddy, no." The words came out smaller than she meant them to, a child's plea from a grown woman's throat. "Please." Thomas wouldn't meet her eyes. "Clara, honey, you don't understand. I understand perfectly." Her voice grew stronger, even as everything inside her was breaking. "You're selling me, like I'm a horse or a piece of furniture. Your own daughter." "It ain't like that." But he still wouldn't look at her. "You need a husband anyway. Sam's got a good spread, a solid house." 2 dead wives, Clara cut in, and now there was steel beneath the fear. "Or did you forget about them?" "Watch your mouth, girl." Yates took a step toward her, and Clara saw the flash of rage in his eyes, the promise of what her life would become if she let this happen. "You'll speak respectful to your future husband. I'm not marrying you. You don't get a say." Yates turned back to Thomas. "Well, we got a deal, or not." Thomas Whitmore looked at his daughter for one long moment, and Clara saw everything she needed to know in his face. The calculation, the relief, the cowardice. He'd made his choice before they'd even walked into the rusty nail tonight. "We got a deal." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. Around the room, men shifted and murmured. Some looked uncomfortable. Most just looked entertained. This was the best show they'd had in weeks. Yates grinned, reaching for Clara's arm. "Come here, wife. Let's seal this proper with a kiss." "Get your hands off her." The voice came from the doorway, and it stopped everything. Not because it was loud, it wasn't, but because it carried a weight that made every man in the room remember that there were things in these mountains more dangerous than debts and desperate fathers. Clara turned, and her breath caught for a different reason entirely. The man in the doorway had to duck to clear the frame. He was tall, 6.5 feet easy, maybe more, and built like the mountains themselves, all solid muscle and hard angles. His coat was bearskin, worn and weathered, and beneath it she could see homespun wool and buckskin, the practical clothing of someone who lived where civilization ended. His face was half hidden behind a dark beard, but what she could see was all sharp edges and hard lines, with a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, pulling the corner of his mouth into a permanent hint of a snarl. But it was his eyes that held her. Gray as winter storm clouds, cold as the mountain peaks, and looking at her with an intensity that made her feel stripped bare and seen all at once. "Silas Boone." Frank Nolan's voice held a careful neutrality that Clara recognized as fear wrapped in politeness. "Ain't seen you in town for near about 6 months. What brings you down from the high country?" Silas didn't answer immediately. He stood in the doorway, snow dusting his shoulders, his breath misting in the warm air of the saloon. His gaze swept the room, cataloging threats and exits with the automatic efficiency of a predator, before settling back on Clara. "Heard talk in the mercantile," he said finally. His voice was rough, like it didn't get used much. "Man selling his daughter to clear his debts." "Ain't your concern," Yates said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. Everyone knew the stories about Silas Boone, the mountain recluse who'd killed a grizzly with a knife, who'd lived through 2 winters that should have killed him, who'd fought in the Indian Wars and come back with more scars than words, and a reputation for violence that kept even the bravest souls from venturing too far up the mountain trails. I'm making it my concern. Silas stepped fully into the room, and men shifted aside without seeming to mean to, like water parting for a stone. Girls being sold against her will. That don't sit right. She's his daughter, Yates protested. He's got the right. No man's got the right to sell another human being. Silas's hand moved to his belt, where Clara could see the handle of a hunting knife that looked like it had tasted blood more than once. Thought we fought a war about that not 20 years back. This is different, Thomas interjected, finally finding his voice. This is family business. Family business. Silas's laugh was sharp and humorless. That what you're calling it? Looked more like a sale to me. Frank Nolan cleared his throat. Silas, we don't want trouble. Then there won't be trouble. Silas pulled out a leather pouch from inside his coat, weighed it in his palm. The heavy clink of gold was unmistakable. He threw it on the poker table where it landed with a solid thunk that made the bills scatter. That's $300, gold, more than Yates is offering. I'm buying her contract or her hand or whatever you're selling. She comes with me. The room erupted. Yates surged to his feet, face purple with rage. Thomas stared at the gold like he couldn't quite believe it was real. Frank reached for the pouch with the automatic reflex of a man who'd spent his life counting money. And Clara just stood frozen, caught between horror and something that might have been hope but felt too dangerous to name. You can't just, Yates started. I can and I am. Silas cut him off, his voice flat and final. Unless you want to outbid me. Got another 300 in gold sitting around. Yates's face worked through several expressions before settling on impotent fury. They all knew he didn't have it. His ranch was mortgaged, his cattle scattered by the harsh winter. He'd been betting on Clara as cheap labor and free breeding stock, not as something he'd have to actually pay premium price for. Thomas grabbed the pouch before anyone could stop him, weighing it like Silas had, his hands shaking. 300? Count it if you don't believe me. Silas's eyes never left Clara's face. Well, girl, you'd rather go with him? He jerked his chin toward Yates. Or take your chances with me. It was the first time anyone had asked her opinion all night. The first time anyone had treated her like she had a choice in what happened to her own life. Clara looked at Samuel Yates, cold-eyed, cruel-mouthed, with his dead wives and his casual violence. Then she looked at Silas Boone, scarred, dangerous, unknown, but who'd just offered her something that felt like a choice, even if it was just picking which unknown fate to walk into. You, she heard herself say. I'll go with you. Yates exploded. The hell she will. Tom, you can't. But Thomas was already counting the gold, his fingers fumbling over the coins, and Clara saw the exact moment he stopped being her father and became just another man who'd sold something he couldn't afford to keep. Deal's done, Sam, Frank said, scooping up his share of the money. Girl chose Boone, that's that. Chose? Yates's laugh was ugly. She didn't choose nothing. She's been bought and sold like the property she is. Then I guess we got something in common. Silas moved toward Clara, and she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. Up close, she could see that the scar on his face was old, silvered with time, and that his eyes weren't entirely cold. There was something else there, something that might have been understanding. You got belongings? At the boarding house, Clara managed. Not much. Get them. We leave in an hour. Now wait just a damn minute, Thomas started, finally looking up from his gold, perhaps realizing he'd just sold his daughter to a man who was more legend than human, who lived in the high peaks where winter killed the careless and the weak. You got your money, Silas said, and there was finality in it. You got no daughter. That's the deal you made. Live with it. He offered Clara his arm, a gesture so incongruously gentlemanly from this bear of a man that she almost laughed. But she took it, felt the solid muscle beneath the rough fabric, felt the steady calm of someone who'd made a decision and wouldn't be moved from it. As they walked toward the door, the crowd parted like they were dangerous, and maybe they were. The mountain recluse and the sold daughter, making a deal the town would talk about for years. Clara. Thomas's voice stopped her at the threshold. She turned, saw her father standing by the poker table with his gold, looking suddenly small and old and pathetic. "I'm sorry, I had no choice." "Yes, you did." Clara's voice was steady, though her heart was hammering. "You just made it." The cold hit her like a slap when they stepped outside. February in Montana was not kind to the unprepared, and Clara's wool coat was thin, worn through at the elbows, inadequate for real winter. She shivered, and without a word, Silas shrugged out of his bearskin coat and draped it over her shoulders. It was heavy, still warm from his body, and smelled of wood smoke and pine and something wild. Clara pulled it close, felt the weight of it like armor, like protection, like a promise she didn't dare believe yet. "Thank you," she said quietly. Silas grunted, which she was learning might be his version of "you're welcome." He led her down the frozen mud of Main Street toward the boarding house, his long strides eating up the ground while she struggled to keep pace. The town was quiet at this hour, most folks already home and huddled against the cold, but she could see curtains twitching as they passed, could feel eyes on them, could imagine the gossip that would sweep through Red Hollow by morning. The boarding house was a sagging two-story structure that smelled of boiled cabbage and resignation. Mrs. Henderson, who ran it, appeared in the doorway as they approached, her face a mask of curiosity and disapproval. "Clara Whitmore," she said, her voice sharp. "I heard what happened at the Rusty Nail. Disgraceful. Your father should be horsewhipped." "Yes, ma'am." Clara didn't have energy for anything else. "And you," Mrs. Henderson turned her glare on Silas. "Silas Boone. Should have known you'd be involved in something unseemly." "Just collecting what I paid for, ma'am." Silas's voice was flat, unaffected by the judgment. "Girl needs to get her things." "I won't have you in my house," Mrs. Henderson said primly. "Clara can fetch her belongings herself. You wait out here." Silas nodded once, then leaned against the porch railing, apparently content to stand in the freezing night. Clara hurried inside, climbed the narrow stairs to the tiny room she'd shared with two other women, both of whom were thankfully absent. Her belongings fit in a single carpet bag, 2 dresses, both worn, with undergarments carefully mended, a hairbrush that had been her mother's, a small Bible, though she hadn't opened it in months, a tin daguerreotype of her mother, young and smiling, before life and Thomas Whitmore had worn her down to nothing. Clara held the image for a moment, studying the woman who'd died when she was 12, wondering what her mother would think of this night. Would she be ashamed? Relieved? Would she tell Clara to run, or to be brave, or to just survive however she could? "I'm trying, Mama," Clara whispered to the image. "I'm trying." She tucked the daguerreotype carefully into the bag, took one last look at the room that had been her refuge for the past 3 years, and walked out. She didn't look back. Silas was exactly where she'd left him, unmoved by the cold or the weight. He took her bag without asking, shouldering it like it weighed nothing, and started walking. Clara followed, her mind spinning with questions she didn't dare ask. Where was he taking her? What did he expect from her? What happened when they reached wherever they were going? Was this rescue or just a different kind of trap? They walked to the edge of town, where Silas had left 2 horses tied outside the mercantile. One was a massive roan stallion that looked like it could carry a bear. The other was smaller, a sturdy mountain pony with intelligent eyes and a patient demeanor. "You ride?" Silas asked. "A little." Clara had learned as a girl before her father sold their horses. "Good. That's Rosie. She's steady. Won't spook easy." Silas helped her mount. His hands on her waist were impersonal, efficient, treating her with the same care he'd shown the carpet bag. Once she was settled, he handed up a thick blanket. "Wrap up. It's 15 miles to the cabin, and it gets colder as we climb." 15 miles. Into the mountains. In the dark. Clara's fear spiked again. But what choice did she have? Go back to the Rusty Nail? To her father's non-existent protection? To Samuel Yates's cruel hands? She wrapped the blanket around herself, and Silas mounted his own horse with the easy grace of someone who'd spent more time in a saddle than in a chair. They rode out of Red Hollow in silence, leaving behind the warm lights of the town, the murmur of voices, the last vestiges of civilization. The trail climbed steadily, switchbacking up the mountainside, and with each turn the temperature dropped and the wind picked up. Clara's thighs burned from gripping the saddle. Her hands went numb even inside her gloves. Her face felt frozen, her breath coming in sharp gasps as the altitude made itself known. But she didn't complain, didn't ask to stop, didn't show weakness. She'd made her choice, and she'd live with it. Silas rode ahead, a dark shape against darker night, occasionally looking back to make sure she was still there. He didn't speak, didn't offer encouragement or explanation, just led her up and up and up into a world of pine and stone and silence. After what felt like hours, but was probably less than 2, they crested a ridge, and Clara saw it. A cabin tucked against the mountainside, crude but solid, with smoke curling from a stone chimney and warm light visible through cracks in the shutters. Home. Or prison. She wasn't sure which yet. Silas dismounted, then helped her down. Clara's legs nearly buckled when her feet hit the ground, numb and trembling from the cold and the ride. He steadied her with a hand on her elbow, then led both horses to a small barn while she stood shivering in the yard. The door to the cabin opened, and an old woman appeared, or what Clara first thought was an old woman, until she realized it was just age and weather carved deep. She might have been 50 or 70. It was impossible to tell, with skin like leather and eyes sharp as flint. "So you did it," the woman said, looking Clara up and down. "Bought yourself a wife." "Bought her freedom from worse," Silas corrected, emerging from the barn. "Mary, this is Clara Whitmore." "Clara, Mary Running Deer. She lives 2 ridges over, helps me with trapping. Brought her to make sure everything's proper." Clara understood then. A chaperone. Proof that whatever was happening here wasn't what the town would assume. Some small piece of propriety salvaged from an improper situation. "Come inside, girl," Mary said, not unkindly. "You're half frozen and look about ready to drop. We'll sort everything else after you've thawed." The cabin's interior was exactly what Clara expected. Rough-hewn logs, basic furniture built for function, not beauty, furs on the floor and hanging from pegs on the wall. A fire burned in the stone hearth, and the warmth hit her like a benediction. She stumbled toward it, her frozen hands reaching for heat. Mary pushed a mug of something hot into her hands. Tea, strong and bitter and perfect. Clara drank it gratefully while Silas and Mary talked in low voices by the door, their conversation just noise she couldn't parse through her exhaustion. "Proper marriage if you're doing this. Not what I paid for. Town won't care about your intentions. Let her choose when she's ready." Clara's eyes were closing, the warmth and the tea and the emotional devastation of the night pulling her under. She felt hands, Mary's, she thought, guiding her to a bed in the corner, felt a heavy blanket being tucked around her, heard voices murmuring reassurances she was too tired to understand. And then, finally, sleep claimed her, dragging her down into darkness where she didn't have to think about fathers who sold daughters, or mountain recluses with scarred faces, or the uncertain future that waited when she woke. Her last conscious thought was simple and devastating. What have I done? The morning came with brutal efficiency. One moment Clara was deep in exhausted sleep. The next she was jolted awake by the sound of an axe biting into wood, sharp, rhythmic, relentless. She opened her eyes to unfamiliar surroundings, momentarily disoriented before memory crashed back. The rusty nail, the poker game, her father's betrayal, Silas Boone's cold gray eyes and colder gold. The mountain ride through darkness. This cabin that was now what? Her home, her prison, her salvation, or her doom? Clara sat up slowly, her body protesting. Every muscle ached from the ride, from the cold, from the tension of holding herself together when everything inside was screaming. The cabin was empty except for her, pale morning light filtering through the shutters, the fire banked but still radiating warmth. She stood on shaky legs, wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, and moved to the window. Through gaps in the wooden slats, she could see Silas in the yard, stripped to his shirt sleeves despite the February cold, splitting logs with the same efficient brutality he seemed to bring to everything. Each swing was precise, economical, splitting the wood clean through with a single strike. Clara watched him for a long moment, trying to reconcile this strange new reality. This was the man who'd bought her last night. who'd paid $300 in gold for reasons she still didn't understand, who'd brought her to this isolated cabin miles from anything that could reasonably be called civilization. The door opened, and Mary entered with an armload of wood and a basket that smelled like fresh bread. She glanced at Clara, gave a sharp nod that might have been approval, and began building up the fire. "You're awake. Good. Breakfast in 10 minutes. Then we talk." Mary's voice left no room for argument. Clara found her bag in the corner, pulled out a fresh dress, her other dress, really, since she only owned two, and changed quickly, grateful that Mary kept her back turned to give her privacy. She braided her hair with fingers that still felt clumsy from yesterday's cold, splashed water from a basin on her face, and tried to feel like a person instead of property that had changed hands. Breakfast was simple but substantial. Bread, butter, eggs scrambled with wild onions, coffee so strong it could strip paint. Clara ate mechanically, her stomach a knot of anxiety, while Mary watched her with those sharp, assessing eyes. Silas came in as she was finishing, his presence filling the small cabin, making it feel even smaller. He washed his hands in the basin, poured himself coffee, and sat down across from Clara with the same economy of movement he brought to everything else. "We need to establish some things," Mary said, taking charge of the conversation with the ease of someone used to being obeyed. "First thing, what exactly is this arrangement?" Silas looked at Clara. "What do you want it to be?" The question caught her off guard. "What? You heard me?" His gray eyes were steady on hers. "I paid your father for your freedom, not for you. You don't owe me anything. You want to stay here? You stay. You want me to take you to the next town, give you stake money to start over. I'll do that too. Your choice." Clara stared at him, searching for the trap, the angle, the cruelty that she'd learned to expect from men. But his face was impassive, unreadable, offering nothing but the blunt truth of his words. "I don't understand," she said finally. "You paid $300. "I got $300, Silas interrupted. "Mining claim paid out last year. Money's no use up here. But I saw what was happening in that saloon, and I—" He paused, seeming to search for words. "I couldn't let it stand, so I made it stop. That's all." "That's all." Clara's laugh was sharp, edged with hysteria she was fighting to control. "You bought me like I was livestock, and you're saying that's all?" "I bought your freedom from a man who would have broken you." Silas's voice didn't rise, but there was steel underneath. "Samuel Yates. You know what happened to his wives? They died. The first one walked into a door so many times her face was unrecognizable at her funeral. The second one ran away and they found her frozen to death 3 miles from his ranch. Or that's the story Yates tells. Body was never found." Silas leaned forward slightly. "That was your future if I'd walked away. So yeah, I paid $300 to make sure that didn't happen. You want to call that buying you, go ahead. But I call it giving you a choice you didn't have before." The silence that followed was heavy. Mary cleared her throat. "Boy's got a point, even if he's terrible at explaining it. Question stands, Clara. What do you want?" What did she want? Clara had spent so little of her life being asked that question, she barely knew how to answer. She wanted her mother back. She wanted her father to be the man he'd been before drink and debt destroyed him. She wanted to live in a world where women weren't sold to pay gambling debts. But those weren't options on the table. "I don't want to go to another town," she said slowly. "I have no money, no skills anyone would pay for. I'd end up in the same situation, or worse." "And here?" Mary prompted. Clara looked around the cabin, crude but solid, warm, safe. Looked at Silas, dangerous and scarred, but who'd offered her the first real choice she'd had in years. Looked at Mary, who was clearly here to make sure this strange man kept his word. "Here I could work," Clara said. "Earn my keep, pay back the $300 eventually." "Don't need paying back." I need to pay it back," Clara's voice was firm. "I won't be property and I won't be charity. If I stay, I work. Fair exchange." Something that might have been respect flickered across Silas's face. "Fair enough. You can cook?" "Yes." "Clean, mend, preserve food, handle a rifle if you need to?" "I can learn the rifle part." "Close enough." Silas stood, the matter apparently settled in his mind. Cabin needs work. I'm not much for housekeeping. You handle that, plus cooking and the like. We'll call it even. Sound fair? For $300? For staying alive through winter this far up. That's worth more than gold. Mary snorted. He's not wrong. This ain't Red Hollow, girl. This is real mountain living. Winter's not done with us yet. Not by half. You'll earn that $300 just by surviving to spring. Clara looked between them, these two strange people who were offering her something that felt like freedom, even if it came wrapped in isolation and harsh reality. She thought about the alternative. Another town, another man like her father or Samuel Yates, another night at another rusty nail. Then I'll stay, she said. And I'll survive. Good. Silas grabbed his coat. Mary will help you settle in, show you where things are. I've got trap lines to check, won't be back until dark. We'll talk more then. He was gone before Clara could respond, the door closing behind him with quiet finality. She was left alone with Mary, who was studying her with those sharp eyes. You're braver than you look, Mary said finally. Or more desperate. Hard to tell which. Both, Clara admitted. Fair answer. Mary began clearing the breakfast dishes. Come on then, let's see what you're made of. What followed was a crash course in mountain living that made Clara's head spin. Mary showed her the root cellar, dug deep into the mountainside and stocked with preserved vegetables, smoked meat, sacks of flour and beans and rice. Showed her the spring house where milk and butter stayed cold, the hen house with its 6 hardy chickens, the small barn where Silas kept his horses and Mary's mule. She learned where Silas kept his trapping equipment, his ammunition, his spare rifles. Learned that the crude cabin was actually ingeniously designed, built to withstand the brutal mountain winters, with thick walls chinked with mud and moss, a solid roof weighted with stones, shutters that could be barred against wind and bears. Mary taught her how to bank the fire at night so it would last until morning, how to melt snow for water when the spring ran low, how to tell good wood from bad for burning. Taught her which supplies were critical and which were luxury, how to make a little last a long time when the nearest store was a day's ride away. By the time Silas returned at dusk, Clara's head was full of information and her body was exhausted, but she'd cleaned the cabin thoroughly, organized the chaotic jumble of supplies into something approaching sense, and had a pot of stew bubbling over the fire that smelled like actual food instead of desperation. Silas stopped in the doorway, looking around with an expression Clara couldn't quite read. You didn't have to do all this, he said finally. Yes, I did. Clara stirred the stew, not looking at him. I told you. Fair exchange, he grunted, his all-purpose response, and hung up his coat. Mary gone? About an hour ago. Said she'd check back in a few days. Another grunt. Silas washed up, then sat at the table she'd scrubbed clean. Clara dished out stew, poured coffee, set out the bread Mary had left. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the wind beginning to pick up outside. Storm coming, Silas said eventually. Big one. We'll be snowed in for a few days, likely. Clara's hand tightened on her spoon. Snowed in. Alone. With this strange, scarred man she barely knew. You'll sleep there. Silas nodded toward the bed in the corner where she'd spent last night. I'll take the floor by the fire. Mary left you some things. Extra blankets, warmer clothes. They'll fit well enough. You don't have to sleep on the floor. Yes, I do. His tone left no room for argument. You may be here by choice now, but choice means you get to feel safe. Can't feel safe if I'm in the bed next to you. Clara studied him across the rough table, this man who'd bought her freedom with gold and was paying for it again with his own comfort. Why did you really do it? She asked quietly. Last night. Why did you really buy me from my father? Silas was quiet for a long moment, his scarred face turned toward the fire. Had a sister once, he said finally. Younger than me. Pretty girl. Sweet. Our pa, he got into debt like yours did. Man came to collect, decided he'd take her instead of money. He paused, his jaw working. I was off fighting the war. Didn't know until I came home. By then she was already dead. Married to a bastard who worked her until she broke, then buried her in an unmarked grave and took himself another wife. Clara felt her throat tighten. I'm sorry. Not your burden. Silas looked at her finally. But when I heard what was happening at the Rusty Nail, when I saw you standing there looking like my sister probably looked, I thought, not again. Not if I can stop it. So you stopped it. So I stopped it. He stood, began preparing his makeshift bed by the fire. You don't owe me gratitude, you don't owe me anything, but you're safe here, Clara Whitmore. That's a promise. And I don't break my promises. Clara believed him. Maybe she was foolish too, but she believed him. Outside, the first snow began to fall. The storm hit 3 hours after midnight with the fury of something alive and vengeful. Clara woke to the sound of wind screaming around the cabin like a wounded animal, rattling the shutters, howling down the chimney with enough force to send sparks dancing from the banked fire. She sat up in the darkness, her heart hammering, disoriented and afraid in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be since arriving. Just wind. Silas's voice came from near the fireplace, calm and matter-of-fact. Storm settling in. Go back to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. Clara lay in the darkness, listening to the wind trying to tear the mountain apart, wondering if the cabin would hold, if they'd wake to find themselves buried in snow or blown clear off the ridge. Every crack and groan of the timbers made her flinch. Every particularly violent gust made her breath catch. You're keeping yourself awake with fear, Silas said after a while. Cabin stood for 12 years through worse than this. It'll stand tonight. How can you be sure? Because I built it to last. There was quiet pride in his voice. Every log chosen, careful, every chink sealed proper, foundation set deep into bedrock. This cabin don't care about storms. It just waits them out. Clara pulled the blanket tighter around herself. Is it always like this? The winter up here? Sometimes worse. She heard him shift, adding wood to the fire. The light grew, pushing back the darkness, and she could see him silhouetted against the flames. February's the meanest month. Winter's been going on so long it's got mean, but spring's still too far off to hope for. March ain't much better. April sometimes brings mercy. That's 2 more months, more or less. He poked at the fire, sending up a shower of sparks. You're regretting your choice already. Was she? Clara considered it honestly. She was cold, isolated, trapped in a cabin with a man she barely knew while nature tried to kill them both. But she wasn't being pawed by Samuel Yates, wasn't listening to her father's drunken excuses, wasn't watching her worth being calculated in poker chips and whiskey debts. No, she said finally, just wondering if I'm strong enough for this. You rode 15 miles up a mountain in the dark without complaint. You're strong enough. Silas stood, moved to the window, peered through the shutters. Storm like this, we might be snowed in 3-4 days. Maybe a week if it's really ornery. You claustrophobic? I don't think so. Good. Because there's nowhere to go until it passes. Clara lay back down, but sleep still eluded her. She listened to Silas moving around the cabin with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew every inch of his space, checking seals around the windows, adjusting the fire, doing whatever mysterious things mountain men did to prepare for being buried alive by weather. Silas? She said into the darkness. Yeah? Tell me about building the cabin. If you don't mind, just something to think about besides the wind. There was a long pause, and Clara thought maybe she'd overstepped, asked for more than he was willing to give. But then his voice came, low and thoughtful, and she realized he was just gathering memories he probably hadn't shared in years. Came up here right after the war, he began. Needed somewhere the world couldn't find me. Somewhere I could hear myself think without all the noise and the people and the expectations. Found this ridge in late spring, knew it was right soon as I saw it. Good water, good timber, game trails all around, southern exposure for the cabin so I'd get maximum sun in winter. Clara closed her eyes, letting his voice anchor her against the storm. Spent that whole first summer just cutting and preparing logs. Had to be perfect. Too green and they'd warp, too dry and they'd crack. Each one had to be straight, strong, without rot or beetle damage. Took me 4 months just to get enough for the walls. That's a long time. Building right takes longer than building fast. But building right means you're still alive when the wind tries to tear you apart. He added more wood to the fire. Foundation was the hardest part. Had to dig down through topsoil, through clay, all the way to bedrock. Took me 3 weeks with just a shovel and a pickaxe. But once I hit that solid stone and set the first cornerstones, I knew this cabin would outlast me. Clara found herself relaxing despite the storm, drawn into the story of how this rough sanctuary had come to be. Raised the walls slow, careful, every log notched perfect so they'd lock together, every gap chinked with mud and moss so the wind couldn't find its way through. Made mistakes, had to tear down and rebuild more than once. But each mistake taught me something, made the next part better. Were you alone the whole time? Mostly. Mary came by once or twice, brought supplies, told me I was crazy for building this far up. She was probably right. There was a hint of amusement in his voice. But crazy's better than dead, and down in the towns I was dying bit by bit. Up here, even when the work was brutal and the loneliness was crushing, at least I was alive. The wind screamed particularly hard, and Clara felt the cabin shudder but hold. Silas was right. It was built to last. Took me until first snow to finish, he continued. Roof was the last part. Had to race the weather. Laid the rafters, pegged them solid, covered them with split shakes and tar paper, and weighted the whole thing with stones. Finished 3 days before the first big storm hit. Sat in here that first night, listening to the wind just like we are now, wondering if I'd done it right, or if I'd wake up dead. But you didn't. But I didn't. She heard the smile in his voice. Woke up warm and dry with snow piled 6 feet against the door, and I knew I'd done it. Built something that would stand. Something that was mine, that I'd made with my own hands and my own sweat. First thing I'd built in years that wasn't meant for killing. Clara understood then. This cabin was his redemption, his way back from whatever darkness the war had carved into him. Every log was a prayer, every chink was healing, every storm survived was proof that he could survive anything. Thank you, she said quietly. For what? For building it strong enough to hold us both. Silas didn't answer, but she heard him settle back down by the fire, and somehow in the sharing of his story, the storm outside seemed less terrifying and the darkness less absolute. When Clara finally slept, it was to dreams of careful hands raising walls against chaos, of stones set deep in bedrock, of shelter built from will and timber, and the stubborn refusal to break. She woke to silence so complete it was disorienting. The wind had died sometime in the early hours, leaving behind a hush that felt almost sacred. Pale light filtered through the shutters, the particular brightness that meant snow had fallen deep and was reflecting the morning sun. Silas was already up, had the fire going strong, coffee brewing, and was pulling on his heavy coat. "Storm's past," he said when he saw her stirring. "Need to dig us out, check the barn, make sure the animals made it through. You stay inside, keep warm." But Clara was already getting up, pulling on the warmer clothes Mary had left. Thick wool pants that were too big in the waist but could be belted, a heavy flannel shirt, wool socks that actually kept her feet warm. "I'll help." "No need. I said I'd earn my keep." She met his eyes steadily. "That doesn't mean just when it's convenient." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite approval, but close. He nodded once, tossed her a pair of heavy gloves and a knit cap. "Then let's see what we're dealing with." He opened the door, and Clara's breath caught. Snow had drifted against the cabin nearly to the roof's edge, a wall of white that glittered in the morning sun. Beyond it, the world had been transformed into something alien and beautiful. Trees bent under the weight of snow, the landscape softened into curves and slopes, everything silent and still, and absolutely buried. 4 feet at least, Silas said, already reaching for the shovel leaning by the door. Maybe 5. This is going to take a while. It took hours. Silas cut a path from the door to the barn, while Clara worked to clear the immediate area around the cabin, her muscles screaming protest with every shovelful. The snow was heavy, wet, the kind that packed solid and made you work for every inch of progress. Her back ached, her shoulders burned, her breath came in ragged gasps in the thin mountain air. But she didn't stop, didn't complain, didn't ask for rest. She watched how Silas worked, steady, methodical, conserving energy for the long haul instead of burning it all in a burst, and tried to match his rhythm. "You're going to hurt yourself," he said when he passed her on his way back from the barn. "This kind of work takes conditioning you don't have yet." Then I'll build it. Clara drove the shovel into the snow again, ignoring the way her hands had gone numb inside the gloves, ignoring the sharp ache in her lower back. How else am I going to get stronger? Silas studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Fair point. But when your body tells you to stop, listen to it. Mountain doesn't care about pride. It'll break you if you let it. He was right about the breaking part. By the time they'd cleared paths to the barn, the spring house, and the hen house, Clara was shaking with exhaustion, her muscles water, her vision swimming. She leaned on the shovel, trying to catch her breath, and felt Silas's hand on her elbow. That's enough for today, he said, his voice gentle in a way she hadn't heard before. Come on, inside. You need food and rest. Clara wanted to protest, but her body wouldn't cooperate. She let him guide her back to the cabin, let him settle her by the fire while he heated up stew from the night before. She peeled off the wet gloves with fingers that barely worked, saw her palms were red and starting to blister despite the protection. Here. Silas knelt beside her, taking her hands in his much larger ones, examining the damage with a frown. Should have wrapped these better. My fault. My hands, Clara said. My fault. Stubborn. But there was no heat in it. He fetched a tin of salve from somewhere, worked it carefully into her palms, his touch surprisingly gentle for such rough hands. You don't have to prove yourself all at once, you know. Winter's long. Plenty of time to show what you're made of. I already know what I'm made of, Clara said quietly. I'm made of everyone who ever looked at me and saw weakness, saw someone too big, too soft, too much. I'm made of every cruel word, every pitying look, every door closed in my face. And I'm tired of it. I'm tired of being what other people decided I was. Silas finished with the salve, sat back on his heels, those gray eyes studying her face. And what did you decide you are? Stronger than they thought. Clara flexed her sore hands, felt the ache of work well done. Strong enough to survive this. Strong enough to be useful. Strong enough to matter. You already matter. Silas stood, went to dish out the stew. But I understand the need to prove it to yourself. Just don't kill yourself doing it. They ate in companionable silence, and Clara felt something settling in her chest. Not quite belonging, not yet, but the beginning of it. The sense that maybe, just maybe, she'd found a place where her strength was valued more than her appearance, where her will mattered more than her size, where she could build something real from the wreckage of her old life. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that was both brutal and oddly comforting. Silas checked his trap lines when the weather allowed, sometimes gone from dawn to dusk, sometimes overnight if he went to the far reaches of his territory. When he was gone, Clara worked to transform the cabin from a functional space into something approaching a home. She scrubbed years of bachelor neglect from every surface, organized the chaotic jumble of supplies into something sensible, mended clothes that had been torn and ignored, darned socks that were more whole than wool. She learned to bake bread in the Dutch oven buried in coals, to make coffee strong enough to strip rust, to stretch meager supplies into meals that actually tasted like something. And slowly, so slowly she almost didn't notice, the mountain began teaching her its lessons. She learned that water from snow had to be melted slowly or it would taste flat and dead. Learned to read the sky for storms coming, to feel the drop in pressure that meant bad weather was building, to smell the particular sharpness in the air that signaled more snow. Learned which wood burned hot and which burned long, which could be burned green in an emergency, and which would just smoke and smolder. Mary came by when the weather broke, riding her mule through snow that was still thigh-deep in places, her face creased with concern. Thought I better check, she said, stomping snow off her boots in the cabin. Make sure Silas hadn't done something stupid like freeze you to death or work you to death or just generally prove men are useless at caring for anything delicate. I'm not delicate, Clara said, and Mary's sharp eyes took in her reddened hands, her sun and wind-burned face, the new hardness in her jaw. No, Mary agreed. I don't suppose you are. Or weren't to begin with, and this place is just making it obvious. She accepted coffee, settled at the table. How are you managing, really? Clara considered the question honestly. It's hard. Harder than anything I've ever done. The cold is worse than I thought. The work is endless, and sometimes the loneliness feels like it's going to crush me. She paused. But I'm not broken, and I'm not going back. Good. Mary sipped her coffee, made a face. Still makes his coffee strong enough to wake the dead, I see. Some things never change. She set down the cup. But some things do. Cabin looks better than I've ever seen it. Smells better too, come to that. And Silas, he's different. Different how? Talks more. Smiles occasionally. Stands a little straighter, like maybe he's remembered he's part of the living world instead of just existing in it. Mary's eyes were sharp on Clara's face. You're good for him, whether he admits it or not. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. I'm just doing the work we agreed on. Sure you are. Mary's smile was knowing. And he's just providing shelter out of the goodness of his heart. Neither of you is fooling anybody but yourselves. Before Clara could figure out how to respond to that, Silas came in from checking the barn, snow dusting his shoulders, his face reddened from the cold. He stopped when he saw Mary, and something that might have been pleasure crossed his features. Mary, wasn't expecting you till the pass cleared more. Figured I'd risk it, needed to check on your new wife. The word was deliberately provocative, and Clara saw Silas's jaw tighten. She's not my wife. Town thinks she is. You bought her in front of half of Red Hollow, brought her up here, been living together for near about 2 weeks now. What else they going to think? Town can think what it wants. Silas hung up his coat with more force than necessary. Clara's here by choice, working for her keep, free to leave whenever she wants. That's the truth. And when spring comes and she wants to go back down, what then? The question hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. Clara realized she hadn't thought about spring, about what happened when the snow melted and the passes opened and she could theoretically leave. Did she want to? Where would she go? Back to Red Hollow, where everyone knew she'd been sold like livestock? To another frontier town where she'd be just another woman with no prospects and no protection? That's her choice to make when the time comes, Silas said finally. Not mine, not yours, not the town's. Hers. Mary nodded slowly. Fair enough. Just wanted to make sure we were all clear on that. She stood, pulled on her coat. I'll be back in a week or so, weather permitting. Brought you some supplies, coffee, sugar, salt, a few other things. They're on the mule. You didn't have to do that, Clara said. Of course I didn't. But winters up here are mean enough without running out of coffee. Mary paused at the door. You're doing good, girl. Better than I thought you would, if I'm being honest. Keep it up. After she left, silence settled over the cabin. Silas brought in the supplies Mary had left, and Clara helped him sort and store them, both of them carefully not discussing what Mary had said about spring, about choices, about what the town thought and what the truth was. That night, as Clara lay in her bed and Silas settled by the fire, she found herself thinking about the future for the first time since the rusty nail. Spring felt impossibly far away, but it would come eventually. The snow would melt, the passes would open, and she would have to decide, stay in this harsh, beautiful isolation with a man she was only beginning to understand, or go back to a world that had never wanted her in the first place. The decision should have been easy, but lying there in the darkness, listening to the fire crackle and Silas's steady breathing, Clara realized it was anything but. March came in like a wounded bear, mean, unpredictable, and dangerous. Some days teased them with warmth and sunshine that made the snow sparkle and drip, promising that winter might finally be loosening its grip. Other days brought storms that made February look gentle, burying them again in fresh snow and howling wind that lasted for days. Clara learned to read Silas's silences, to distinguish between the quiet of contentment and the quiet of pain. She noticed he favored his left leg on cold mornings, saw him sometimes press a hand to his ribs like something there still ached. Wore wounds, she suspected, old injuries that would never fully heal, made worse by the brutal work of mountain living. She learned he liked his coffee black and scalding, his bread dense and hearty, his stew thick enough to stand a spoon in. Learned he was meticulous about his weapons, cleaning and oiling them with a care that bordered on reverence. Learned he had nightmares sometimes, waking with a gasp and his hand reaching for the knife he kept under his blanket, his eyes wild and unseeing until reality reasserted itself. She learned not to ask about those nights. Just kept the fire built up so he could see where he was, made fresh coffee if he wanted it, gave him space to remember he was safe. And slowly, incrementally, she learned to survive. Her hands toughened, the blisters hardening into calluses. Her breath came easier at altitude as her lungs adapted. Her muscles stopped screaming quite so loudly after a day's work, building strength she'd never known she had. The weight that had once felt like a burden became an advantage. She stayed warmer than someone smaller might have, had strength in her core and legs that served her well in deep snow, could work longer without needing to eat. Silas noticed. She caught him watching her sometimes as she split kindling or hauled water, something like approval in his gray eyes. "You're adapting," he said one evening as they sat by the fire, Clara mending one of his shirts while he worked on a new pair of snowshoes. "Mountain's accepting you." "The mountain doesn't have much choice," Clara said, biting off thread. "I'm too stubborn to let it kill me." "Stubborn's kept more people alive than sense ever did." He bent one of the wooden frames, testing its flexibility. "Though sense helps too." "You think I don't have sense?" "I think you got more than most people credit you for. You wouldn't have survived this long otherwise." He paused, seemed to consider his words carefully. "You're stronger than you know, Clara. Stronger than anyone in that saloon ever gave you credit for." Clara's hand stilled on the mending. It was the first time he'd really referenced that night. The poker game, the sale. They saw what they wanted to see, someone weak, someone worthless. Their blindness doesn't make it true. "No." Clara looked at him across the firelight. "But it made me believe it for a long time. Made me think maybe they were right. Maybe I was useless and unwanted and too much of everything wrong." Silas set down the snowshoe frame, met her eyes directly. "You want to know what I see?" Clara wasn't sure she did, but she nodded anyway. "I see someone who rode 15 miles up a mountain in the dark without complaint. Someone who's worked herself raw learning to survive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Someone who could have given up a dozen times, but chose to keep fighting instead." His voice was steady, matter-of-fact, which somehow made the words hit harder. "I see strength, real strength, the kind that matters when everything else falls away." Clara felt something break open in her chest, some long-held knot of shame and self-doubt loosening just slightly. "Thank you," she managed. "Just telling the truth." Silas went back to his work, apparently considering the matter settled. But Clara sat there holding his shirt, those words echoing in her mind, and felt something shift in how she saw herself. Maybe he was right. Maybe she was stronger than she'd ever allowed herself to believe. Maybe survival wasn't just about enduring, it was about proving to yourself that you could. The next morning, she woke to find Silas already dressed and armed, checking his rifle with the particular care that meant danger. "What's wrong?" Clara sat up, instantly alert. "Tracks outside, big cat. Mountain lion by the size, been circling the cabin." His voice was calm but serious. "Probably smelled the chickens, maybe the horses. Storms made hunting hard for the predators. They're getting desperate, coming closer to human habitation than they normally would." Fear spiked through Clara. "What do we do?" "I track it. Make sure it moves on. You stay inside, keep the rifle loaded. Don't open the door for anything that doesn't sound like me." He handed her one of his rifles, showed her how to load and cock it. "Probably won't come to anything, but mountain lions are unpredictable when they're hungry." "I could come with you," Clara offered, though her hands were shaking slightly on the rifle. "No, if something goes wrong, I need to know you're safe here, can defend yourself if you need to." He pulled on his heavy coat, his hat. "I'll be back by nightfall. If I'm not back by morning, take the horses and head for Mary's. Don't try to find me." "Silas, promise me, Clara." His eyes were intense on hers. "This mountain will kill you if you give it the chance. Don't give it the chance." Clara swallowed hard. "I promise." He nodded once, then slipped out into the gray dawn, and Clara was left alone with the loaded rifle and her racing heart, and the knowledge that danger was circling closer than she'd ever imagined. The day stretched endless. Clara kept herself busy cleaning, organizing, cooking, but her ears were always straining for sounds outside, her eyes constantly going to the windows, to the door, watching for Silas's return or the mountain lion's approach. She checked on the chickens twice, made sure the barn was secure, brought extra firewood inside in case she needed to barricade herself in for the night. The rifle stayed within arm's reach wherever she went, a constant cold reminder of the threat stalking through the trees. Nightfall came with no sign of Silas. Clara lit the lamps, built up the fire, made coffee she couldn't drink because her stomach was too knotted with fear. She sat at the table with the rifle across her lap, watching the door, listening to every creak and whisper of the cabin settling, every distant crack of a branch breaking under snow. Where was he? Had he found the lion? Had something gone wrong? Was he lying hurt somewhere in the snow while she sat here safe and useless? The knock at the door made her jump, her hands tightening on the rifle. "Clara, it's me. Open up." Silas's voice, but strained. Clara rushed to the door, threw back the bolt, and gasped. He was leaning heavily against the doorframe, his face gray beneath his beard, his left arm clutched against his ribs. Blood stained his coat, dark and spreading, and his breath came in short, pained gasps. "Caught up to the cat," he said through gritted teeth. "Killed it, but it got a piece of me first. Need help getting inside." Clara dropped the rifle, grabbed his right arm, half carried him to the chair by the fire. "How bad?" "Bad enough." He winced as she helped him shrug out of his coat. Beneath it, his shirt was soaked with blood from 3 parallel gashes across his ribs, deep enough that Clara could see muscle beneath. "Claws caught me when I got too close. My own damn fault." Clara's hands shook as she fetched water, clean cloth, the bottle of whiskey Silas kept for emergencies. She'd never done this before, never treated a serious wound, but there was no one else. Mary was miles away and unreachable. It was just her, and Silas was bleeding, and she had to figure it out or he might die. "Talk me through it," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "Tell me what to do." And he did, his voice tight with pain but clear, walking her through cleaning the wounds with whiskey that made him hiss and curse, stitching the deepest gash with needle and thread sterilized in flame, bandaging everything tight to stop the bleeding. Clara's hands steadied as she worked, finding a competence she didn't know she possessed, doing what needed to be done because there was no other choice. When it was finished, Silas's face was white and sheened with sweat, but the bleeding had stopped and the wounds were clean and closed. "You did good," he managed. "Real good." "Don't ever do that again," Clara said, and her voice shook now that the crisis had passed. "Don't go after mountain lions alone. Don't come back bleeding and half dead. Don't—" Her voice broke. Silas reached out with his good hand, caught hers. "I'm sorry. You're right. Was stupid and reckless. Won't happen again." Clara gripped his hand hard, feeling the calluses, the strength, the warmth that proved he was alive. "You better mean that." "I do." He smiled slightly, though pain creased his features. "Can't have my best worker worrying herself sick every time I leave the cabin." "Best worker?" Despite everything, Clara felt herself smile. "I'm your only worker." "Still the best?" His thumb brushed across her knuckles. "Thank you, Clara. For keeping your head. For helping me. For being stronger than you think you are." Clara looked at their joined hands, at this dangerous, damaged man who'd saved her from one fate and was teaching her to survive another, and felt something warm unfold in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with the choice she knew she'd already made, even if spring was still weeks away. She was staying, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because this harsh, beautiful place had become something she'd never had before. It had become home. Silas healed slowly, his body fighting infection and pain, while spring crept closer with agonizing reluctance. Clara tended him with a fierceness that surprised them both, changing his bandages twice daily, forcing bitter willow bark tea down his throat for the pain, monitoring the wounds for any sign of fever or rot. She took over his work without being asked, checking trap lines on the closer trails, feeding and watering the animals, splitting wood until her shoulders screamed and her hands bled through the calluses. The mountain tested her in his absence from the daily routine, throwing late March storms that buried the paths she'd just cleared, freezing the water in the spring house solid, sending a pack of coyotes sniffing around the henhouse in the dead of night. But Clara met each challenge with grim determination, learning to shoot the rifle with accuracy born of necessity, learning to read animal tracks in the snow. learning that fear was just another thing to work through rather than surrender to. "You're going to kill yourself trying to do everything," Silas said one evening, watching her collapse into the chair across from him, her face gray with exhaustion. "Someone has to." Clara flexed her sore hands, studied the new blisters forming beneath the old calluses. "And you're in no condition. I'm healing fine thanks to you, but that doesn't mean you need to work yourself to death proving something." "I'm not proving anything." Clara met his eyes. "I'm surviving. There's a difference." Silas studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. "When I bought you from your father—" "You didn't buy me," Clara interrupted. "You bought my freedom from him. There's a difference there, too." "Fair point." He shifted in his chair, wincing as the movement pulled at his healing ribs. "What I'm trying to say badly is that I never expected you to become this. Someone who could run a mountain homestead alone, who could face down danger without flinching, who could—" He stopped, searching for words. "You're not the frightened girl from the rusty nail anymore." "No," Clara agreed quietly. "I'm not. That girl died somewhere between here and there. I'm what's left." "And what's that?" Clara considered the question, looking at her rough hands, her worn clothes, feeling the strength in her back and arms and will. "Someone who survived. Someone who's done surviving and started living." Before Silas could respond, the sound of horses approaching broke the evening quiet. Multiple horses moving fast, and Clara's hand went instinctively to the rifle leaning against the wall. "Easy." Silas was already standing, his own rifle in hand despite the pain it clearly caused him. Could be Mary, could be trappers passing through. But the tension in his voice said he didn't believe that, and when Clara peered through the shutters, her blood ran cold. 6 men on horseback, and she recognized 3 of them even at a distance. Samuel Yates sat tall in his saddle, his face set in hard lines. Beside him rode Sheriff Tom Brennan, Red Hollow's excuse for law enforcement, a man more interested in who paid him than what was right. And trailing behind, looking small and pathetic and drunk even from here, was her father Thomas Whitmore. "It's Yates," Clara said, her voice tight. "And the sheriff. And my father." Silas cursed, low and vicious. "Get away from the window. Stay inside no matter what happens." "What are you going to do?" "Talk to them. See what they want. But if shooting starts, you barricade this door and don't open it for anyone but me or Mary. Understand?" Clara wanted to argue, wanted to stand beside him, but the look in his eyes stopped her. This was his mountain, his fight, and he needed to know she was safe before he could face whatever was coming. "I understand," she said, and watched him walk out into the fading light, his rifle held loose but ready, his body language calm despite the injury she knew was paining him. Clara pressed her ear to the door, straining to hear over the hammer of her own heartbeat. "Silas Boone." Yates's voice carried clear and cold through the evening air. "Been a while." "Not long enough." Silas's response was flat. "What brings you to my mountain, Yates? You're a long way from your ranch." "Official business," Sheriff Brennan spoke up, his voice trying for authority and landing somewhere near bluster. "We're here about the girl, Clara Whitmore." "What about her?" "You took her unlawfully," Yates said, and Clara could hear the barely contained rage beneath his words. "Bought her from a man too drunk to consent, removed her from town against her will, held her here against her wishes." "That's kidnapping, Boone. That's a hanging offense." Silas's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Against her will? She chose to come with me, in front of half the town. You were there, Yates. You saw her choose." "A choice made under duress doesn't count," Brennan said. "Her father here says you threatened him, forced the sale. Says his daughter's been held prisoner up here all winter. Her father's a lying drunk who sold her to clear his debts." Silas's voice hardened. "And you know it, Brennan. You were in the Rusty Nail that night. You saw what happened." "I saw a transaction that looked questionable at best." Brennan shifted in his saddle. "Look, Boone, I don't want trouble. Just let us see the girl, confirm she's all right, and we can all go home peaceful." "She's fine. And she's staying here." "That's not your decision to make." Yates urged his horse forward, and Clara heard the creak of leather, the jingle of tack. "She's coming back to Red Hollow with us, one way or another." Over my dead body." That can be arranged. The new voice was unfamiliar, cold, and professional. Mr. Boone, I'm Deputy Marshal Crawford, out of Helena. I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment. You can come peaceful, or we can do this the hard way. Clara's hands clenched into fists. A federal marshal. They'd brought a federal marshal. This wasn't just Yates's wounded pride or her father's guilt. This was official, legal, dangerous in ways that couldn't be fought with rifles and determination. Let me see the warrant, Silas said. There was a rustling of paper, a long silence while Silas presumably read. Then his voice came again, tight with controlled fury. This is dated 3 weeks ago. You've been planning this. We've been preparing a case, Crawford said. Multiple witnesses testify that you removed Miss Whitmore from Red Hollow against her wishes, that her father protested the transaction, that you've held her here without allowing her contact with family or friends. The warrant's legal and binding. Now, you can surrender peacefully, or— The explosion of gunfire cut him off. Clara heard shouts, the scream of horses, Silas's voice raised in warning or defiance, she couldn't tell which. She grabbed the rifle, her hands shaking, torn between the promise to stay inside and the desperate need to know what was happening. More shots, the crack of return fire, a man's cry of pain, the thunder of hooves, then silence, broken only by harsh breathing and someone groaning. Clara couldn't stand it anymore. She threw open the door, rifle raised, and froze. Silas was on his knees in the snow, blood streaming from a gash on his temple, his rifle kicked several feet away. 4 men surrounded him, guns drawn, while Yates sat his horse with a smile that made Clara's skin crawl. Her father was on the ground, apparently thrown when his horse spooked, looking dazed and pathetic. The federal marshal was pressing a hand to his shoulder where blood seeped between his fingers, his face gray with pain and fury. Clara! Silas's voice was rough. Get back inside. Well, well. Yates swung down from his saddle, walking toward her with predatory confidence. There she is. The woman worth all this trouble. Tell me, Clara, has he been treating you well? Or have you been suffering up here, waiting for rescue? Clara looked at the men surrounding Silas, at the guns pointed at him, at the blood on his face and the pain in his eyes. Looked at her father, who wouldn't meet her gaze. Looked at Yates, who thought he'd won, who thought she was a prize to be claimed and a wrong to be avenged. And she made a choice. I haven't been suffering, she said clearly. I've been free. Yates's smile faltered. Free? You call being held prisoner on a mountain free? I call making my own choices free. I call working for myself free. I call not being property free. Clara stepped forward, the rifle steady in her hands. Silas didn't kidnap me. He gave me an option my own father denied me, and I took it. You're confused, girl, Brennan said, his voice trying for paternal concern. You've been isolated, probably threatened. It's natural to develop sympathies for your captor. I'm not confused, Clara's voice cut through his patronizing explanation, and I'm not going back with you. You don't have a choice, Yates said flatly. Boone's under arrest. This property will be seized. You'll be returned to your father's custody, as is proper and legal. My father sold me, Clara's voice rose. He gambled me away like I was livestock, and you— She pointed the rifle at Yates. You were going to claim me like I was property. The only crime here is that anyone thinks they own me. Lower the rifle, Miss Whitmore. Marshal Crawford's voice was tight with pain but carried authority. You're not helping your situation. My situation? Clara laughed, sharp and bitter. My situation was being traded like currency by men who saw me as worthless except for what I could provide them. My situation was spending 22 years being told I was too much and not enough all at once. My situation was having no choices, no future, no hope. And then Silas gave me a chance to have all 3. By buying you, Yates sneered. He's no better than your father or me. He just paid more. He paid for my freedom, not for me. Clara glanced at Silas, saw understanding in his eyes, saw something else there too, pride, maybe, or respect, or something deeper she didn't have time to name. And I chose to stay. Every day since, I've chosen to stay. That's not kidnapping, that's liberation. Enough talk. Yates pulled his own rifle, aimed it at Silas. Boone's going back to Red Hollow to stand trial. The girl's coming with us. Anyone who objects can join him in a cell. You can't just, Clara started. Watch me. Yates gestured to two of his men. Tie him up. Put him on a horse. If he resists, shoot him in the leg. Don't need him walking to hang him. Clara watched in helpless rage as they hauled Silas to his feet, wrenched his arms behind his back, bound his wrists with rope that cut into his skin. He didn't fight, couldn't fight, not against four armed men without getting himself killed, but his eyes never left Clara's face. Don't do anything stupid, he said quietly as they dragged him toward the horses. Stay safe, that's all that matters. No, Clara's voice was steel. You staying alive is what matters. Yates backhanded her across the face, the blow hard enough to snap her head sideways and fill her mouth with the copper taste of blood. You'll learn respect soon enough. Once we're married and you're legally mine, I'll teach you proper behavior. Clara spat blood into the snow, her vision swimming, her cheek already swelling. I'll die before I marry you. That can be arranged too. Yates grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. But first you'll watch Boone hang. You'll watch him die knowing it's your fault. Then we'll discuss your future. They threw Silas across a horse like a sack of grain, tied his hands to the saddle, his feet beneath the horse's belly. The position was deliberately painful, especially with his injured ribs, and Clara saw him bite back a groan as they cinched the ropes tight. Her father finally found his voice. Clara, sweetheart, this is for the best. You'll see. Once you're back home, once you're properly married, you'll understand you're not my father anymore. Clara's voice was quiet, but absolute. You stopped being my father the night you sold me. You're just the drunk who taught me what men become when they abandon everything that makes them human. Thomas flinched like she'd struck him, but he didn't argue. Couldn't argue. They both knew she was right. Mount up, Brennan ordered. We ride for Red Hollow within the hour. Storm's building, and I want to be off this mountain before it hits. They forced Clara onto a horse, tied her hands to the saddle horn, positioned her in the middle of the group where she couldn't run even if she tried. Yates rode beside her, close enough that his leg brushed hers, a constant reminder of his intentions. Clara looked back at the cabin as they rode away, the home she'd built from nothing, the sanctuary that had taught her strength, the place where she'd learned that survival was its own kind of victory. She looked at the paths she'd cleared, the wood she'd split, the smoke still rising from the chimney of a fire she'd built and tended and kept alive through the worst winter could throw at her. And she felt something harden in her chest, something cold and sharp and absolutely certain. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The ride down the mountain was brutal. The storm Brennan had worried about caught them halfway down, turning the trail into a treacherous ribbon of ice and mud and near vertical drops. The horses struggled, their hooves slipping, their breath coming in labored gasps as they navigated switchbacks barely wide enough for a single rider. Silas, tied and helpless across his horse, took the worst of it. Every jarring step drove the saddle into his injured ribs. Every slip and recovery threatened to throw him completely. Clara watched him grit his teeth against the pain, watched blood seep through the bandages beneath his shirt, watched him slowly being broken by the journey and his inability to protect himself. By the time they reached Red Hollow, it was full dark and Silas was barely conscious. They dragged him off the horse and threw him into the jail behind the sheriff's office, a stone building with iron bars and a reputation for cruelty that went back decades. Clara tried to go to him, but Yates's hand on her arm stopped her. He's where he belongs, Yates said. Tomorrow there will be a trial. Day after, a hanging. By the end of the week, you and I will be married and this whole ugly business will be forgotten. Never, Clara said. We'll see. Yates gestured to one of his men. Take her to the boarding house. Lock her in. Guard the door. If she tries to leave, stop her. I don't care how. They marched Clara through Red Hollow's muddy streets while townspeople stared and whispered. She held her head high despite her bound hands, despite the bruise blooming purple across her cheek, despite the utter helplessness of her situation. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her broken. Mrs. Henderson met them at the boarding house, her face a mask of disapproval that seemed directed more at Clara than at the men forcing her inside. I'll have no trouble in my establishment, she said primly. No trouble, Yates assured her. Just keeping Miss Whitmore safe until the wedding. Wouldn't want her wandering off and getting hurt in her confusion. The room they locked her in was the same one she'd left months ago, small, cold, smelling of cabbage and defeat. Clara heard the key turn in the lock, heard heavy footsteps outside the door, and finally allowed herself to slump against the wall. Silas was in jail, injured and helpless. She was locked in a room with a guard outside. Her father had betrayed her twice now. The law was on Yates's side, twisted though it was. Tomorrow there would be a trial that was really just a formality before an execution. And then Yates would claim her, would force her into marriage, would spend the rest of her life teaching her the lessons his previous wives had learned. Clara closed her eyes, fought back the despair that threatened to drown her. Then she opened them again and looked around the room with new eyes. Not a prison, a starting point. She had survived a mountain winter, had learned to shoot, to track, to work until her body screamed and then keep working, had stitched up a man's torn flesh and kept him alive through fever and pain, had faced down mountain lions and blizzards and the crushing loneliness of isolation. She had not survived all that just to surrender now. Clara moved to the window, examined the frame. Old wood, warped by years of weather. The nails holding it shut were rusted, the paint cracked. She pressed against it experimentally and felt it give slightly. She had no weapons, no supplies, no plan beyond a growing determination that she would not let this stand. But she had something more valuable than any of that. She had become someone who did not quit. Clara wrapped her hand in the thin blanket from the bed, gripped the window frame, and began to work it back and forth, slowly widening the gap, feeling the old wood start to splinter. Outside, she could hear the guard's footsteps, regular and pacing. Inside, the window creaked and groaned, but slowly, infinitesimally, began to give. This would take hours, maybe all night. But she had all night. And she had something Yates and her father and every man who'd ever underestimated her didn't have. She had nothing left to lose. The window finally gave way near 3 a.m, the frame cracking with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night. Clara froze, listening for the guard's reaction, but he'd apparently dozed off or wandered away because no alarm was raised. She squeezed through the narrow opening, her body barely fitting, the rough wood scraping her arms and catching her dress. For a moment she stuck, trapped halfway through, panic rising as she imagined being caught like this, helpless and ridiculous. But she thought of Silas tied to that horse, of the noose waiting for him, of Yates's cold eyes and colder intentions, and she forced herself through with a final desperate heave that left her dress torn and her arms bleeding but free. Clara dropped into the alley behind the boarding house, landing in mud that soaked through her boots. She crouched there for a moment, listening, but the town was silent. Red Hollow slept, unaware that the woman they dismissed as weak and worthless was moving through the darkness with purpose. The sheriff's office was on the far side of town, separated from the boarding house by Main Street and too much open ground to cross unseen. But Clara had learned patience on the mountain, had learned to move quietly, to use shadows, to think 3 steps ahead. She circled through back alleys and side streets, keeping to the darkness, avoiding the few pools of lamplight that still burned. Once she had to press herself flat against a building as a late-night drunk stumbled past, singing off-key and oblivious. Once a dog barked, and she froze, heart hammering until it lost interest and quieted. When she finally reached the jail, she found it dark except for a single lamp burning in the office. Through the window, she could see a deputy slouched in a chair, his hat pulled low over his eyes, apparently asleep at his post. The jail cells were in the back, accessible through a door that Clara knew would be locked and probably reinforced. She couldn't break in, couldn't fight the deputy, couldn't free Silas through force, but maybe she didn't need to. Clara circled the building, found the small barred window that looked into the cell area. She picked up a handful of gravel, tossed it gently against the bars. The sound was soft, but in the silence of night it carried. "Silas," she whispered. "Silas, are you there?" For a long moment, nothing. Then movement in the darkness, and his face appeared at the window, bruised and bloody, but alert. "Clara." His voice was rough with relief and fear. "What the hell are you doing here? They catch you outside, they'll lock you up too." "They're not going to catch me." Clara gripped the bars, pressed her face close. "Are you all right? Your ribs?" "Forget my ribs. You need to get out of here. Get to Mary's. Get somewhere safe. I'm not leaving you to hang." "You don't have a choice." Silas's voice was urgent. They've got 6 armed men guarding this place. The trial's at noon. By sunset, I'll be dead. But you can still get away. Please, Clara, don't let my mistake trap you too. Your mistake was saving me, Clara said, and I'm about to return the favor. How? You can't break me out, can't fight them, can't… Watch me. Clara stepped back from the window, her mind racing through possibilities and discarding them just as fast. She couldn't break him out, couldn't overpower the guards, couldn't make him disappear. But she could change the equation, could give him a chance, could create chaos enough that maybe, just maybe, they could both survive this. Listen to me, she said, her voice low and intense. When you hear the fire bell, be ready. When things start happening, don't hesitate. Don't try to be noble, just survive. Can you do that? Clara, what are you planning? Promise me. When you get your chance, you take it. You run, you live. Promise me. Silas looked at her through the bars, and even in the darkness she could see the conflict in his eyes, the desire to protect her warring with the understanding that she was beyond protection now, that she'd become something neither of them had expected. I promise, he said finally. But Clara, I'll see you on the other side of this. She pressed her hand to the bars, felt his fingers grip hers for one brief moment. One way or another, then she was gone, moving through the darkness toward the one place in Red Hollow she knew would burn fast and bright and hot enough to bring the whole town running. Samuel Yates's general store sat on the corner of Main and First, a 2-story structure filled with dry goods and supplies and profit made from gouging desperate people during the winter months. It was also, Clara knew from her time in town, where Yates stored his whiskey, his kerosene, and all the other flammable merchandise that made him money. Breaking in was easier than she'd feared. The back door's lock was cheap, the wood around it rotten from weather. Clara used a rock to smash through, the sound covered by wind that had picked up again, promising another storm by morning. Inside, she found what she needed: kerosene in barrels and bottles, lamp oil, whiskey in crates, dry fabric and paper goods. Everything necessary to turn the store into an inferno. Clara worked quickly, methodically, pouring kerosene across the floor, soaking the fabric displays, splashing whiskey on the wooden shelves. Her hands were steady despite her racing heart. This was arson. Was destruction of property. Was probably enough to get her hanged alongside Silas if they caught her. But they'd already decided to destroy her life. She was just returning the favor. When everything was ready, Claire took a last look around the store that represented Yates's greed and cruelty and power over this town. Then she lit a match, dropped it into the pool of kerosene at her feet, and ran. The fire caught fast, faster than she'd expected, racing across the floor and up the walls with a hunger that was almost alive. By the time Clara made it out the back door, flames were already licking at the windows, and smoke was billowing into the night sky. She ran for the shadows, for the safety of the alley across the street, and waited. The fire bell started clanging within minutes, the frantic rhythm cutting through the night. Doors flew open, voices shouted, boots pounded on the boardwalks as Red Hollow woke to chaos. Clara watched from her hiding place as people poured into the street in their nightclothes, as bucket brigades formed, as men shouted orders and women herded children away from the spreading flames. And she watched as the deputy guarding the jail abandoned his post, running toward the fire with everyone else, leaving the sheriff's office unguarded in the confusion. Clara didn't hesitate. She ran across the street, through the unlocked door of the office, grabbed the key ring hanging on the wall. The cell area was dark, but she knew the way by feel now, knew which key fit the lock. "Silas," she called, fumbling with the keys, her hand shaking now that the moment had arrived. "Where are you?" "Here," his voice came from the nearest cell. "Clara, is that fire? Did you—" "Don't ask questions." The lock clicked open and Clara yanked the door wide. "Can you walk?" "Can I—" "Clara, what did you do?" "I burned down Yates's store." She grabbed his arm, pulled him toward the office. "Now move before they figure out the fire was a distraction." Silas stared at her for one long moment, and Clara saw shock and admiration and something fiercer fighting for dominance in his expression. Then he was moving, limping but fast, following her out into the chaos of Red Hollow burning. The fire had spread to the building next to Yates's store, and flames were reaching toward the sky like hungry hands. Smoke filled the street, making it hard to see, hard to breathe. People ran in every direction, some fighting the fire, some trying to save their belongings. All of them too focused on the disaster to notice two figures slipping through the confusion toward the edge of town. They made it to the livery stable before someone shouted behind them. "The prisoners escaped! Boone's escaped! Move!" Silas shoved Clara toward the horses, his hands working the saddles and bridles despite the pain she knew he must be in. "Get Rosie. We need to move now." Clara mounted with none of the grace she'd learned on the mountain, pure adrenaline and desperation getting her into the saddle. Silas swung onto his roan, and they kicked the horses into a gallop just as gunfire erupted behind them. Bullets whined past Clara's head, thudded into the stable walls, sent splinters flying from fence posts. She leaned low over Rosie's neck, trusted the horse to find her footing in the darkness, and rode like her life depended on it. Because it did. They thundered out of Red Hollow, with half the town screaming after them, and the fire painting the sky orange behind them, riding toward the mountains that had become more home than anywhere else ever had, riding toward freedom or death with equal probability and equal acceptance. And Clara felt something she hadn't felt in months, maybe years, maybe ever. She felt alive. The horses ran until their sides heaved and foam flecked their mouths, racing up the mountain trail in darkness broken only by the fading orange glow of Red Hollow burning behind them. Clara's thighs screamed from gripping the saddle, her hands were numb on the reins, and her heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. Behind them, she could hear shouts fading into the distance, the occasional crack of a rifle shot that fell harmlessly into the night, and the thunder of pursuit that was coming whether they were ready or not. Silas pushed them hard for the first hour, taking trails Clara barely recognized even in daylight, switchbacking up steep grades that made the horses grunt and strain. Only when they reached a plateau thick with pine did he finally slow, letting the horses catch their breath while he listened to the night behind them. "How many?" Clara managed, her voice raw from smoke and fear and exertion. "Hard to say. 6, maybe 8 riders. Maybe more." Silas's face was grim in the starlight. "Yates won't let this go. You burned down his livelihood, freed a condemned man, made him look like a fool in front of the whole town. He'll hunt us until he catches us, or we're both dead." "Then we don't let him catch us." Clara straightened in her saddle despite the exhaustion pulling at her bones. "You know these mountains. Where do we go?" "Higher." Silas urged his horse forward again, though at a slower pace now. "There's a high valley about 6 miles from here, near the tree line. Good defensive position, water, shelter. If we can reach it before they catch up, we might have a chance." "And if we can't?" Silas looked at her, and Clara saw the truth written plain in his scarred face. "Then we make our stand wherever we are and hope we take enough of them down to make the rest think twice." They rode on through the darkness, the trail growing steeper and more treacherous with each mile. The temperature dropped as they climbed, the air thinning until each breath felt inadequate. Clara's dress was torn and inadequate for the altitude, her boots soaked through from snowmelt, her exposed skin burning with cold. But she didn't complain, didn't ask to stop, didn't show the weakness that was eating at her edges. Dawn found them still climbing, the sky lightening to gray and then pale gold behind the peaks. In the growing light, Clara could see how badly Silas was suffering. His face was gray beneath his beard, his breathing labored, fresh blood seeping through his shirt where the rough ride had reopened his wounds. He swayed slightly in the saddle, catching himself with visible effort. "Silas, you need to rest." "Can't. They're too close." He pointed down the slope and Clara's stomach dropped. In the distance, moving up the trail like a dark serpent, she could see them. 8 riders? Maybe more. Spread out in a hunting formation that spoke of experience and determination. Even at this distance, she could make out Yates in the lead, sitting his horse like vengeance incarnate. "How long until they catch us?" Clara asked. "An hour. Maybe less if we have to slow down." Silas studied the terrain ahead with tactical assessment. "But there's a narrow defile about a mile ahead, barely wide enough for 2 horses. Rocky walls on both sides, no way around. If we can get through it and trigger a rock slide behind us, we might buy ourselves enough time to reach the high valley." And if we can't trigger a slide, then we'll be trapped in a bottleneck with armed men on both sides. Silas met her eyes. I won't lie to you, Clara. Our odds aren't good. You could still surrender, claim I forced you to help me escape. They might believe it. Clara thought about that for exactly 1 second. Thought about going back to Red Hollow, to her father's hollow apologies, to Yates's cold ownership, to a life measured in submission, in silence, and slow death of the spirit. Thought about everything the mountain had taught her, everything she'd become, everything she'd finally learned she was worth. No, she said simply. We finish this together, or not at all. Something fierce and proud flashed across Silas's face. Then let's make them earn it. He kicked his horse into motion again. Stay close. When I tell you to ride, you ride as fast as Rosie can manage. Don't look back, don't slow down, don't wait for me. Understand? I'm not leaving you behind. Clara, I said I'm not leaving you. Her voice was steel. You didn't leave me in that saloon. I'm not leaving you on this mountain. That's final. Silas looked like he wanted to argue, but there was no time. The defile was ahead, a narrow slash in the mountainside where ancient water had carved through stone, creating a passage barely wide enough for horses to pass single file. The walls rose 30 feet on either side, jagged and unstable looking, covered with loose scree and precariously balanced boulders. Perfect, Silas muttered. Clara, when we get through, I need you to help me destabilize that northern wall. See that overhang? If we can bring it down, it'll block the passage for hours, maybe days. They pushed through the defile, the horses' hooves echoing off stone walls, Clara's breath coming fast and shallow in the confined space. Every instinct screamed that this was a trap, that they were making themselves vulnerable, but Silas was right. It was their best chance. They emerged on the far side just as the first of their pursuers entered the defile behind them. Now! Silas was already off his horse, grabbing his rifle, aiming up at the unstable overhang. Shoot at the base of that formation where it meets the wall. We need to break the support. Clara dismounted, grabbed the rifle Silas had stolen from the jail, and did as he said. The recoil nearly knocked her backward, the sound deafening in the confined space. Rock chips flew from the wall, but the overhang held. Again! Silas fired, his shot more accurate than hers, striking exactly where the formation met solid rock. A crack appeared, thin but spreading. Behind them, shouts of alarm. The pursuers had realized what they were doing, were backing their horses out of the defile in panicked retreat, but not fast enough. Clara fired again and again, her ears ringing, her shoulder bruising from the rifle's kick. Silas's shots were methodical, surgical, each one widening the crack, destabilizing the formation bit by bit. The overhang groaned, shifted, and Clara saw the exact moment when gravity decided to reclaim what humans had disturbed. Move! Silas grabbed her arm, dragged her back as the entire northern wall of the defile began to collapse. It started with a sound like thunder, deep and rolling and unstoppable. Then the overhang broke free, tons of rock and stone tumbling down in a cascade that filled the narrow passage with debris and dust and destruction. The noise was apocalyptic, drowning out the screams of horses and men, echoing off the peaks until it seemed the entire mountain was coming down. When the dust finally settled, the defile was gone. In its place was a wall of broken stone 20 feet high, completely impassable without excavation equipment and days of work. Clara stood staring at what they'd done, her hands shaking, her mind struggling to process that she'd just brought down a mountain on men who were trying to kill her. "Did we—" she started. "They got out in time," Silas said, though he was leaning heavily against a boulder, his face ashen. "Saw them backing up before it came down. But they won't be following this way. They'll have to circle around, come at us from the north. That buys us 6, maybe 8 hours." "Is that enough?" "Has to be." Silas pushed himself upright with visible effort. "Come on, we need to reach the valley before they find another way through." They mounted again, both of them moving like the wounded now, the adrenaline of the rock slide fading into exhaustion and pain. The horses were tired too, their pace slowing despite Silas's urgings, their heads hanging low as the trail climbed ever steeper. The sun was high overhead when they finally crested the last ridge and Clara saw the valley spread before them, a high mountain cirque surrounded on 3 sides by sheer cliffs, the fourth side accessible only through a narrow pass they'd just traversed. A small lake glittered in the center, still half frozen, and sparse grass showed through the retreating snow. Trees clung to the edges, stunted and wind-bent but providing cover. "This is it," Silas said. "Best defensive position within 50 miles. They want us. They have to come through that pass. And we'll see them coming." He was right. From the valley floor, they'd have clear sightlines to the pass, plenty of time to prepare, natural fortifications in the rocks and trees. It was as close to a fortress as nature provided. But it was also a trap. One way in meant one way out, and if Yates brought enough men, brought enough guns, they could simply wait at the pass and starve Clara and Silas out. "How long can we hold here?" Clara asked. Silas dismounted, nearly fell, caught himself against his horse. "Long as we need to. There's game in the valley, water from the lake, shelter in the caves along the north wall. We could last weeks if we had to." "And them?" "They'll get cold, get hungry, get tired of waiting." Silas unsaddled his horse with movements that were becoming increasingly uncoordinated. "Men like Yates, they're not used to suffering. Eventually they'll give up or make a mistake. Either way, we survive." "Silas?" Clara moved to his side, saw the fresh blood on his shirt had spread, saw the way he was holding his ribs. "You're hurt bad. We need to tend those wounds before anything else. We need to set up defenses. We need you alive to man those defenses." Clara's voice was firm. "Sit down. Let me see." For once, Silas didn't argue. He sank down onto a flat rock, and Clara carefully peeled back his shirt, hissing at what she found. The wounds from the mountain lion had reopened completely, the stitches torn through, the flesh angry and inflamed, fresh blood mixed with fluid that looked suspiciously like infection. "This is bad," she said quietly. "I know." Silas's voice was tight with pain. "But there's nothing for it now. We do what we can and hope it holds." Clara used water from the lake to clean the wounds, her hand steady despite her racing heart. She had limited supplies, some clean cloth torn from her already ruined dress, the salve Silas had brought in his saddlebag, her own determination to keep him alive. She worked as carefully as she could, restitching where possible, bandaging tight to stop the bleeding. "You learned well," Silas said through gritted teeth. "Mountains made you capable." "Mountains made me desperate." Clara tied off the last bandage. "But I'll take desperate over helpless any day." She helped him into a cave along the north wall, not deep, but enough to provide shelter from wind and observation. There was evidence someone had camped here before, a ring of fire-blackened stones, some old bedding material. Silas collapsed onto the ground, his breathing labored. "You need to rest," Clara said. "I'll set up a watch position, gather firewood, see what I can do about making this defensible." "Clara, rest." She squeezed his hand. "I've got this for now. When they come, we'll face them together. But right now, you need to heal." She left him in the cave and went to work, drawing on everything the mountain had taught her. She built a fire pit at the cave entrance, positioned rocks to create low walls that would provide cover, found several good shooting positions with clear lines of sight to the pass. She gathered deadfall wood for fuel, filled their canteens from the lake, even managed to set a snare that might catch a rabbit by nightfall. The sun was setting when she heard horses. Clara grabbed the rifle, positioned herself behind the rock wall she'd built, and watched the pass. 8 riders emerged, Yates in the lead, his face a mask of cold fury even at this distance. They stopped just outside the valley, studying the layout, clearly assessing their options. "Boone!" Yates's voice echoed off the cliffs. "I know you're in there. You're trapped. Nowhere to run. Nowhere to hide. Send out the girl, and maybe we'll make your death quick." Claire felt Silas move up beside her, leaning heavily on the cave wall but steady enough, his rifle in his hands. "That's not going to happen, Yates," Silas called back. "Turn around and go home while you still can." "You think you can hold this valley against 8 armed men?" Yates laughed, harsh and ugly. "You're injured, alone except for a woman who doesn't know which end of a gun to hold. This is over. You've just chosen how it ends." "I choose we make you bleed for every inch." Silas raised his rifle. "First man through that pass dies. Second one too. Maybe the third. How many of your men you willing to sacrifice for your pride, Yates?" There was a long silence. Then Yates turned to his men, spoken voices too low to carry. Clara watched them spread out, taking positions behind rocks and trees at the valley entrance, clearly settling in for a siege. "They're not attacking," she said quietly. "Not yet." Silas lowered his rifle, sweat beading his forehead from just that small effort. "They'll wait until dark, try to infiltrate, or they'll just sit there and starve us out. Either way, we've got a long night ahead." He was right. The sun set, and the temperature plummeted. Clara built up the fire carefully, keeping it small enough not to give away their exact position, but large enough to keep them from freezing. She made what passed for dinner from the dried meat in Silas's saddlebag, forced him to eat even though he had no appetite. "You should sleep," she told him. "I'll take first watch." "Clara, you're exhausted. So are you, and you're injured. I can stay awake longer." She settled herself at the mouth of the cave, rifle across her lap, eyes on the dark pass. "Sleep. I'll wake you if anything happens." She heard him shift, heard the rustle of blankets, heard his breathing gradually slow and deepen. And Clara sat in the darkness, watching the distant glow of Yates's campfire, listening to the night sounds of the valley, and wondered if she would survive to see another sunrise. The attack came near midnight. Clara heard them before she saw them, the soft crunch of boots on snow, the whisper of clothing against rock, the carefully controlled breathing of men trying to move silently. She counted 3 separate sounds, 3 men infiltrating from different angles. She didn't wake Silas, didn't make a sound, just aimed carefully at the nearest shadow and fired. The shot shattered the night. The shadow screamed, fell, and suddenly the darkness erupted with gunfire. Muzzle flashes lit the valley like lightning. Bullets ricocheted off stone, and Clara fired again and again at the shapes moving in the darkness, not knowing if she hit anything but determined to make them pay for every foot forward. Silas was beside her instantly, despite his injuries, his rifle speaking its own language of lead and defiance. Between them, they created a wall of fire that drove the attackers back, sent them scrambling for cover, turned their careful infiltration into a panicked retreat. When the shooting stopped, Clara's ears were ringing and her shoulder ached from the recoil, and the cave mouth was hazy with gun smoke. In the sudden silence, she could hear someone moaning in pain out in the darkness. "Did we hit them?" she asked. "At least one." Silas was breathing hard, holding his ribs. "Maybe more, hard to tell in the dark." "Boone!" Yates's voice came from the pass, ragged with fury. "That's 2 of my men down. 2! This doesn't end until you're both dead. You hear me? Dead!" Silas didn't answer, just reloaded his rifle with shaking hands, and Clara understood. This was beyond reason now, beyond negotiation. This would only end one way, with all of them dead or Yates broken and defeated. The next 2 days blurred together in a haze of cold, hunger, and constant vigilance. Yates's men tried infiltrating twice more, each time driven back by Clara and Silas's defensive position and desperate shooting. But each exchange cost them ammunition they couldn't replace, energy they couldn't spare, and slowly they were being worn down. Silas's fever came back on the second night, his wounds infected despite Clara's best efforts. She tended him as well as she could, but without proper medicine, without clean bandages, without anything but willpower and stubbornness, she could only do so much. "This is my fault," Silas said during a lucid moment, his skin burning hot beneath her hand. "I should have taken you to another town that first night. Should have made sure you were somewhere safe before letting myself care what happened to you." "You gave me a choice," Clara said softly. "That's more than anyone else ever did. Don't regret that now." "I regret getting you killed." "We're not dead yet." Clara squeezed his hand. "And I'm not as easy to kill as they think." On the third morning, Clara woke to silence. Complete, utter silence where there should have been the sounds of Yates's camp, the movements of sentries, the general noise of 8 men living rough. She crept to the cave entrance, rifle ready, and looked out at the pass. It was empty. The campfire was cold, the positions abandoned, not a man or horse in sight. "Silas," she said urgently, "they're gone. Yates and all his men, they're just gone." Silas dragged himself to the cave mouth, looked out at the empty valley, and his face went hard. "It's a trap," he said immediately. "Has to be. They're hiding, waiting for us to come out thinking we're safe. Or they gave up, went back to Red Hollow to regroup." "Yates doesn't give up." Silas studied the terrain with fever-bright eyes. But he might change tactics. This position is too strong to take by force, so he's trying something else. Like what? Silas's answer was cut off by a sound that made Clara's blood run cold. The rumble of falling rock, growing louder, coming from the direction of the pass. The cliffs, Silas breathed. That bastard's bringing down the cliffs. He's going to seal us in. They ran for the cave entrance just as the world exploded into noise and dust and tumbling stone. The northern cliff face was collapsing in a massive landslide, tons of rock pouring down into the valley, filling the pass, cutting off their only escape route. Yates hadn't given up. He just decided if he couldn't kill them directly, he'd bury them alive. Clara watched in horror as the pass disappeared beneath an avalanche of stone, as their escape route was erased, as the trap closed around them with the finality of a coffin lid. When the dust finally settled, they were sealed in the valley with no way out except over cliffs that would kill them just as surely as Yates's bullets. "We're trapped," Clara said, the words hollow. "No." Silas was staring at the rubble, his mind clearly working despite the fever. "No, he made a mistake." "What mistake?" "We're buried alive." "He sealed himself out, not just us in." Silas pointed at the massive pile of debris. "That rockfall goes both ways. He can't get to us any more than we can get to him. And he doesn't know about the northern trail." "What northern trail?" "Old hunting path, barely there, carved into the cliff face about 200 feet up. Haven't used it in years because it's treacherous, but it leads down the backside of the mountain, comes out near Mary's territory." Silas was already moving, gathering supplies despite his obvious pain. "If we can climb to it, if we can make it across, we come out behind Yates's position. We'll be free." Clara looked up at the sheer cliff face, at the narrow trace of path barely visible against the stone, at the 200-foot climb that stood between them and freedom. "Can you make that climb?" she asked quietly. "With your injuries?" "I'll make it or die trying." Silas met her eyes. "But Clara, if I can't, if I fall or the fever takes me, you promise me you'll keep going. You get to Mary's, you get somewhere safe, you—" "Stop," Clara cut him off. "We make it together or not at all. That's been the deal since the beginning. I'm not changing it now." Silas looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Then we better get climbing while I can still stand." They gathered what little they could carry: water, ammunition, one rifle between them, some rope. The horses would have to stay behind, and Clara felt a pang leaving Rosie in the valley. But there was no choice. Where they were going, horses couldn't follow. The climb was brutal from the first handhold. The rock was loose and treacherous, the path barely wide enough for one person, the drop below them waiting patiently for any mistake. Clara went first, testing each grip before putting her weight on it, calling back warnings about loose stone or crumbling edges. Behind her, Silas climbed with grim determination, his breathing labored, his movements becoming less coordinated as fever and pain took their toll. More than once, Clara heard him slip, heard rock skitter away beneath his feet, heard his sharp intake of breath as he caught himself. "Keep going," he gasped when she paused. "Don't stop for me, just keep going." They climbed for what felt like hours, the sun beating down on them during the day, cold seeping into their bones at night when they had to stop and cling to the cliff face until dawn. Clara's hands were raw and bleeding, her muscles screaming, her mind foggy with exhaustion. But she kept climbing, kept moving, kept refusing to let the mountain win. On the second day of climbing, halfway across the cliff face, Silas's strength finally gave out. Clara heard his gasp, heard the skitter of rock, and turned just in time to see him lose his grip. He fell backward, his hands scrabbling for purchase, his eyes wide with the knowledge that this was it. This was how it ended. Clara moved without thinking. She lunged, caught his wrist with both hands, her body slamming against the cliff face with enough force to drive the air from her lungs. For one terrible moment, they both hung there, her grip on the rock the only thing between them and a 200-foot fall. "Let go," Silas said through gritted teeth. "Clara, you can't hold us both. Let go while you still can." "No." Clara's hands were slipping, her fingers going numb, her entire body shaking with the strain. "I said together or not at all." "Clara, shut up and climb!" She shifted her grip, felt her handhold crack ominously. "Use me as an anchor and climb." For a moment she thought he'd refuse, thought his damn nobility would get them both killed. But then he grabbed her arm, used her as a ladder, pulled himself up until he could find new handholds above her position. The strain on Clara's arms was incredible, like being torn apart, but she held on through sheer stubborn will. When Silas was secure, when he could hold his own weight again, Clara's hands finally gave out, and she started to fall. Silas caught her. His hand locked around her wrist with desperate strength, and suddenly it was him holding her over the abyss, him refusing to let go, him proving that survival meant both of them or neither. "I've got you," he said, and Clara heard the absolute conviction in his voice. "I've got you, Clara. I'm not letting go." She found her grip again, pulled herself up, and they clung to the cliff face together, breathing hard, both of them shaking with the knowledge of how close they'd come. "Thank you," Silas said quietly. "For what?" "For not letting go. For being stronger than I gave you credit for. For being exactly what I needed, even when I didn't know I needed it." Clara looked at him across the few feet of cliff face between them, saw the fever-bright eyes and the blood-soaked bandages and the absolute determination to survive, and felt something settle in her chest that had been seeking purchase since the rusty nail. "Let's finish this climb," she said. "Then we can talk about what we mean to each other." They reached the far side of the cliff at sunset on the third day, collapsing onto solid ground with the desperation of the truly spent. Clara lay on her back staring at the sky, her hands destroyed, her body one massive ache, her mind empty of everything except relief at being alive. Beside her, Silas was unconscious, his fever raging, his breathing shallow and fast. They'd made it across, but he was fading fast, and without help he wouldn't last the night. Clara forced herself to sit up, to assess their situation. They were on the backside of the mountain, somewhere in the vast territory that bordered Mary's land. If she was right, if she'd kept track of their position during the climb, Mary's cabin should be no more than 5 miles to the east. 5 miles. With Silas dying and her own body ready to quit. 5 miles that might as well be 50. Clara looked at the man who'd saved her, who'd given her a chance at freedom, who taught her that strength came in forms the world didn't recognize. She thought about leaving him here, going for help alone, maybe making it in time. Then she bent down, got her shoulder under his arm, and hauled him to his feet. "Together or not at all," she muttered. "That's still the deal." She walked through the gathering darkness with Silas's weight bearing her down, his fevered mutterings in her ear, his blood soaking through her torn dress. She walked past the point where her body screamed to stop, past the point where her mind went hazy, past every reasonable limit. She walked because the alternative was surrender, and Clara Whitmore had learned on a mountain in Montana that she was not made for surrender. She walked because somewhere behind them, Samuel Yates was still hunting, still determined to claim what he thought he owned, and she would die before she let that happen. She walked because the woman who'd been sold in a saloon for $300 had become someone who set stores on fire and triggered rock slides and climbed cliff faces over certain death. She walked because she was done being what other people decided she should be. When Mary's cabin finally appeared in the moonlight, Clara was barely conscious, operating on pure will and muscle memory. She pounded on the door with a bloody fist, heard Mary's startled voice, and felt Silas's weight finally leave her shoulders as the old woman caught him. "Clara?" Mary's voice seemed to come from very far away. "What in the name of... what happened?" "Yates," Clara managed, then her legs gave out and she collapsed into Mary's arms. "He's still coming. Need to be ready. Need to..." Darkness took her before she could finish, pulling her down into unconsciousness with Silas's blood on her hands and the certainty that the final confrontation was still ahead. But she'd made it this far. She'd brought them both out of a trap that should have killed them. And when Yates came, when he finally caught up to them, Clara would be ready to finish what she'd started the night she burned his world down. Clara woke to the smell of sage and wood smoke and something bitter brewing over a fire. Her entire body felt like one massive bruise. Her hands were wrapped in clean bandages, and she was lying on a bed softer than anything she'd felt in months. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was or how she'd gotten there, and then memory crashed back with the force of an avalanche. The climb, the valley, Yates hunting them, Silas collapsing, the desperate walk through darkness to Mary's cabin. She sat up too fast, the room spinning, and Mary's weathered hand pushed her gently back down. Easy, girl. You've been out for near about 18 hours. Your body's trying to recover from more abuse than most folks suffer in a lifetime. Silas? Clara managed, her throat raw. Is he alive? Barely. Fighting a fever that should have killed him twice over, but he's stubborn as mountain rock. Mary brought a cup to Clara's lips, and she tasted the bitter brew, willow bark and something else, medicinal and strong. Drink. Your hands are infected, your body's in shock, and you're going to hurt for days. This will help. Clara drank, grimacing at the taste, then forced herself to sit up more slowly. Across the small cabin, she could see Silas lying on another pallet, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths, his face pale and sheened with sweat. Fresh bandages covered his torso, and Mary had clearly been working to save his life while Clara slept. Will he make it? Clara asked quietly. Depends on whether his will to live is stronger than the infection trying to kill him. Mary sat back, studied Clara with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. You carried him 5 miles through mountain terrain with hands torn to shreds and a body ready to quit. Most people wouldn't have made it a quarter mile. What made you keep going? Clara looked at Silas's unconscious form, thought about everything they'd survived together, everything she'd learned about herself in the process. He didn't leave me behind when he could have. I wasn't going to leave him. That's not gratitude, that's something else. Mary's voice was knowing. You love him. It wasn't a question, but Clara answered anyway. I don't know what I feel, but I know I'm not the same person who left Red Hollow, and he's part of why. Maybe the biggest part. Love's a dangerous thing in the mountains, Mary said. Makes you vulnerable, makes you weak when you need to be strong. Or it makes you strong in ways you didn't know existed. Clara flexed her bandaged hands, felt the pain but also the underlying strength that had gotten her this far. I lifted his weight for 5 miles. I climbed a cliff I should have fallen from. I survived what should have killed me. That's not weakness. That's what caring about something more than yourself can do. Mary was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. Fair point. But loving him won't save either of you if Yates finds you here. And he will find you. Men like that don't quit until they're dead or defeated beyond recovery. Then we need to be ready when he comes. Clara stood, ignoring the way her body protested. How defensible is this cabin? More than you'd think. I've had trouble before. Raiders, hostile trappers, one memorable encounter with a bear that thought my door was an invitation. Got rifle ports built into the walls, good sight lines, enough ammunition to hold off a small army if I'm careful. Mary moved to the window, peered out at the forest. But I'm one old woman and you're half dead, and Silas is no use to anyone right now. 8 men with guns could overwhelm us if they're determined enough. 6 men, Clara corrected. Maybe less. We hit at least 2 during the valley fight. Yates is down to 6, and they've been living rough for days now. They're tired, frustrated, probably questioning why they're following a madman on a revenge quest. Still better odds than what we've got. Mary turned from the window. But you're right that we need to be ready. If you're up to it, we should prepare defenses, set some surprises for unwelcome visitors. Your mountain man taught you how to set traps? Clara thought about the snares Silas had shown her, the way he'd explained using terrain as a weapon, the lessons in making the wilderness work for you instead of against you. Some. Enough to be dangerous. Good. Then let's be dangerous together. Mary pulled out a wooden chest from under her bed, opened it to reveal an arsenal that would have impressed a small militia. Rifles, pistols, knives, even a few sticks of dynamite wrapped in oilcloth. I've been preparing for trouble my whole life. About time it paid off. They spent the rest of the day turning Mary's cabin into a fortress. Clara dug pits and covered them with branches and snow, set snares made of wire that would catch a man at ankle height, arranged deadfalls that would trigger if someone approached from the wrong angle. Mary showed her how to create false trails that led to dead ends or cliffs, how to use the forest itself as a maze that only they knew how to navigate. By nightfall, the cabin was surrounded by a network of traps and defensive positions that would make any assault costly. It wasn't enough to stop determined men with guns, but it would slow them down, hurt them, maybe make them think twice. Silas woke near midnight, his fever broken temporarily. his eyes clearer than they'd been in days. Clara was beside him instantly, offering water, checking his bandages, relief flooding through her at seeing him conscious. "Did we make it?" he asked, his voice rough as gravel. "We made it. We're at Mary's. You've been fighting infection for almost 2 days." Clara helped him sit up slightly. "How do you feel?" "Like I got dragged behind a horse for 50 miles. He looked around the cabin, taking in their situation with tactical assessment even through the haze of pain. "Yates?" "Not here yet, but he's coming." Clara filled him in on the defenses they'd prepared, the traps they'd set, the plan, such as it was. "When he gets here, we'll be ready." "Clara." Silas caught her hand, his grip weak but earnest. "What you did, carrying me, getting us here, that was beyond brave. That was what needed to be done." Clara squeezed his hand gently. "You saved me from one kind of death in that saloon. I just returned the favor on that mountain. It's more than that, and you know it." Silas's gray eyes held hers. "When this is over, if we survive this, I need you to know that you don't owe me anything. You're free, Clara, truly free. Free to leave, free to go anywhere, free to build whatever life you want. You've earned that 100 times over." Clara felt something twist in her chest. "And if what I want is to stay? Then you stay because you choose it, not because you think you owe me, not because you're afraid of the world beyond the mountain, but because it's genuinely what you want." His thumb brushed across her knuckles. "I need to know the difference." Before Clara could respond, Mary's sharp whistle cut through the cabin, their agreed signal for danger approaching. "They're here," Mary said from her position by the window. 6 riders, coming up the trail from the south. Yates in the lead, and he looks like murder itself. Clara and Silas exchanged one long look, and she saw everything she needed to see in his eyes. Whatever happened next, whatever choices had to be made, they would face it together first and sort out the rest later. "Help me up," Silas said, already reaching for his rifle. "If Yates wants a fight, let's give him one worth remembering." Clara helped him to a firing position by the window, then took her own position at the opposite wall. Mary moved to the door, her rifle steady in her weathered hands. They waited in tense silence as the sound of hooves grew louder, as Yates and his remaining men emerged from the tree line. The landowner looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past week. His clothes were torn and filthy, his face gaunt with exhaustion and obsession, his eyes burning with a fury that had gone beyond reason into something darker and more dangerous. The 5 men with him looked equally worse for wear, but they were armed and angry and here for blood. "Boone," Yates's voice echoed across the clearing. "I know you're in there. You and that whore who burned down my store. Come out and face justice like men instead of hiding behind an old woman's skirts." "Only whore here is the law you bought in Red Hollow," Mary called back, her voice sharp as a blade. "Why don't you turn around and crawl back to whatever hole you came from before someone puts you in a permanent one?" Yates's laugh was ugly. "You think you can threaten me, old woman? I've got 5 armed men. You've got a dying criminal, a fat girl who doesn't know her place, and your own ancient carcass. How long you think you can hold out?" Clara felt white-hot rage flood through her at his words. Not at being called fat, that old wound had been cauterized by months of proving her strength, but at the dismissal, the assumption that she was still the helpless girl from the saloon who could be bought and sold and discarded. "Long enough to make you regret every step you took up this mountain," she shouted back, and the surprise in Yates's face at her defiance was almost worth everything that came next. "You ungrateful bitch!" Yates drew his pistol. "I would have married you, would have given you a home, a name, a purpose, and you repay me by burning down everything I built, by making me look like a fool, by choosing this scarred bastard over a man of property and standing. You offered me slavery dressed up as marriage." Clara's voice rang clear and strong. "Silas offered me a choice. That's the difference you'll never understand, and I'd rather die on this mountain a free woman than live one more day as your property." "Then die you will." Yates raised his hand, signaling his men to spread out. "All of you, burn them out if you have to. I want them dead or dragging behind my horse. I don't care which." The first man who moved forward triggered Clara's ankle snare. The wire caught his legs and jerked him off his feet, sending him sprawling face first into the snow. The second man stepped into a pit and disappeared with a scream cut short by the sharpened stakes at the bottom. "Fall back!" Yates screamed, but two of his men were already down and the others were scrambling for cover, suddenly aware that the cabin was surrounded by more than just harsh words. Gunfire erupted. Yates's men fired from behind trees and rocks, bullets slamming into the cabin walls, punching through shutters, sending splinters flying. But Mary's rifle ports were well positioned, and the three defenders returned fire with deadly precision. Clara saw one of Yates's men grab his shoulder and fall, saw another duck back behind cover with blood streaming down his face. "They're trying to flank us from the east," Mary called out, swinging her rifle to cover a new angle. "Two men moving through the trees!" Silas tracked their movement through his window, waited until they broke cover, and fired twice in quick succession. One man went down immediately. The other retreated, leaving his companion bleeding in the snow. That left three. Yates and two others pinned down and taking fire, their assault broken against defenses they hadn't expected and determination they couldn't overcome. "This is insane," one of Yates's remaining men shouted. "We're getting slaughtered. I didn't sign up to die for your pride." "You'll die if you desert," Yates screamed back. "Now get up there and finish this." But the man was done. He broke from cover and ran, disappearing into the trees at a dead sprint. The other remaining gunmen looked at Yates, looked at the cabin, and made the same calculation. "To hell with this," he said, and ran. That left Yates alone, surrounded by dead and wounded men, his vendetta reduced to ashes like his store. He stood slowly from behind his rock, his pistol hanging loose in his hand, his face a mask of defeat and rage and something that might have been madness. "You think this is over?" he called, his voice cracking. "You think you've won? I'll never stop. Never. You've destroyed everything I built, everything I am. I'll hunt you until one of us is dead. Then let's finish it now." Silas was on his feet, moving toward the door despite Clara's protest, his rifle steady despite his wounds. "You and me, Yates, one-on-one. You win, you can walk away. I win, you leave Clara alone forever. Your word against mine, witnessed by everyone here." "Silas, no," Clara started. "It's the only way to end this," Silas said quietly. "He'll never stop otherwise. This has to be settled." He walked out into the clearing, and after a moment's hesitation, Yates followed. They stood 20 paces apart, two men carved by violence and pain into something harder than the stone beneath their feet. "You took what was mine," Yates said. "I took nothing. She chose to leave. That's the part you can't accept." Silas shifted his grip on his rifle. "A woman made a choice you didn't like, and you'd rather burn the world down than accept it. She was mine by right. Her father sold her. The transaction was legal. The transaction was immoral. There's a difference." Silas's voice was steady. "And now you've lost men, lost your business, lost your standing in Red Hollow, all because you couldn't let go of something you never really had. Was it worth it, Yates? Was your pride worth all those bodies?" For a moment, something flickered in Yates's eyes. Doubt, maybe, or the first cold touch of sanity. But then it was gone, buried under rage and obsession that had grown too large to control. "Draw," Yates said, his hand moving toward his pistol. Clara watched from the cabin window, her heart in her throat, as both men moved. Yates was fast, his draw smooth from years of practice and violence. His pistol cleared leather and came up in one fluid motion. But Silas was faster. His rifle was already moving, already aimed, and he fired before Yates's pistol reached horizontal. The shot took Yates in the chest, center mass, a killing blow delivered with surgical precision. The landowner staggered backward, his pistol firing into the ground as his fingers spasmed, his face registering shock and pain, and finally understanding that this was how it ended. He fell to his knees in the snow, blood spreading across his shirt, his breathing coming in wet gasps. Silas limped over to him, kicked the pistol away, and looked down at the man who'd hunted them across a mountain. "You could have let her go," Silas said quietly. "Could have accepted that some things aren't for sale. Could have been a better man than your worst impulses. But you chose this." Yates tried to speak, blood bubbling at his lips, but whatever final words he had were lost. He toppled sideways into the snow and went still, his eyes staring sightlessly at the sky. His quest for ownership and revenge ended in the way such quests always ended. with blood and waste and a body growing cold in the mountain air. Silas stood over him for a moment, then turned and walked back to the cabin, each step obviously painful but determined. Clara met him at the door, and without words they held each other, two survivors of a war neither had wanted, but both had won. "It's over," Silas said into her hair. "It's finally over." But Clara knew better. The fight was over, yes. Yates was dead, his men scattered or wounded or dead themselves. But what came next, the real challenge of building something from the wreckage, of choosing a future instead of just surviving the present, that was only beginning. Mary helped them deal with the aftermath. They found the two wounded men and tended their injuries despite everything, because that was the difference between them and Yates. They didn't leave people to die in the snow. One of them, a young kid who'd gotten in over his head, agreed to take a message back to Red Hollow, explaining what had happened. The other, an older gunman with more scars than morals, just wanted to be far away from this cursed mountain. They buried the dead in shallow graves marked with simple stones, including Yates, because that was what decent people did even for their enemies. It took 3 days before Silas was strong enough to help, and by then the first real warmth of spring was finally touching the high country. On the 4th day, Sheriff Brennan rode up to Mary's cabin with a deputy and a white flag. Clara watched him dismount with the caution of someone who'd learned that authority and justice weren't always the same thing. "Come to arrest us?" Silas asked from the cabin porch, his rifle across his knees. "Come to get the truth," Brennan said, and he looked older than when Clara had last seen him, more tired. Word spread about what happened up here. Yates dead, his men scattered, stories about traps and fire, and a woman who wouldn't quit. "I need to know what happened, official-like, so I can put this to rest." They told him. All of it. The poker game, the sale, the winter on the mountain, Yates's obsession, the hunt, the final confrontation. Mary corroborated their account, and the wounded men Brennan had already interviewed matched the story. When they finished, Brennan was quiet for a long moment, then sighed like a man setting down a heavy burden. "Yates's ranch is in foreclosure. His store's burned. His men are gone. Nobody in Red Hollow is going to cry over him being dead. And the few who might aren't going to push it, given how this played out." He looked at Clara directly. "As for the kidnapping charge, I'm ruling it unfounded. Multiple witnesses confirm you chose to leave with Boone, including your father, who's apparently drunk himself into a state of permanent regret. The federal marshal withdrew the warrant after interviewing the witnesses himself, said the whole thing smelled like a rich man buying the law, and he won't be party to it." Clara felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since the rusty nail. "So we're free to go?" "You were always free, Miss Whitmore. Took a hell of a journey for everyone else to recognize it, but the law's finally caught up with the truth." Brennan stood, prepared to leave. "If you're smart, you'll stay up here in the high country. Red Hollow's got a long memory, and not everyone's going to be happy about how this turned out. But legally, you've got nothing to answer for." After he left, Clara sat on Mary's porch watching the sun set over the mountains that had become more home than anywhere she'd ever lived. Silas sat beside her, his wounds healing slowly but surely, his presence solid and comforting. "So what now?" he asked quietly. "You're free. Truly free. You could go anywhere, do anything. What do you want, Clara?" Clara thought about Red Hollow and her father's hollow apologies. Thought about the cities she'd never seen and the life she might build somewhere civilization was kinder. Thought about all the choices that had been denied her for so long and were now suddenly, terrifyingly available. Then she thought about a cabin built strong to withstand the storm. About paths she'd cleared through snow and wood she'd split until her hands bled. About a mountain that had tested her and found her worthy. About a man who'd offered her freedom and then proven it by putting no chains on her heart. "I want to go home," she said. "Where's home?" Clara looked at him, saw the hope and fear warring in his eyes, saw the question he was trying not to ask. 15 miles up the mountain, in a cabin built to last, with a man who taught me that strength comes in forms the world doesn't recognize. Silas's face transformed, something breaking open that she suspected had been locked away for years. "You're sure? It's not gratitude or fear or... It's choice." Clara took his hand, felt the calluses and scars that matched her own. You gave me the power to choose my own life, and I choose this. I choose you. I choose the mountain and the cabin and the brutal, beautiful life we've built. Not because I owe you, not because I have nowhere else to go, but because this is where I'm strongest. This is where I'm truest. This is where I'm home. Silas pulled her close, and Clara felt his heart beating against her cheek, felt the warmth of him, and the absolute certainty that this was right. "Then let's go home," he said, "and build something that lasts." They stayed with Mary another week while Silas healed and the spring melt made the trails passable. Mary watched them with sharp eyes and occasional knowing smiles, and on the day they prepared to leave, she pulled Clara aside. "You've become something remarkable," Mary said. "When I first met you, you were running from one kind of death into an unknown that might have been worse. Now look at you, strong, capable, sure of yourself in ways most people never achieve. The mountain did that, but also you did that. Don't forget the second part." "I won't," Clara promised. "And that man of yours, he's a good one, but he's damaged. War and loneliness carved pieces out of him that might never fully heal. You accepting that?" Clara thought about Silas's nightmares, his silences, the scars he carried inside and out. "I'm damaged too. We'll heal each other, or at least make the damage bearable together. That's all any of us can hope for." Mary hugged her, fierce and brief. "You ever need anything? You know where I am. Don't be a stranger." The ride back to Silas's cabin felt like a homecoming in ways Clara had never experienced. Every turn in the trail was familiar, every landmark a memory of survival and growth. When the cabin finally came into view, still standing despite everything, Clara felt something settle in her soul that had been restless her entire life. They spent the next weeks repairing what winter and absence had damaged. Clara organized and cleaned while Silas mended the roof and reinforced the walls. They worked side by side, their movements synchronized by months of learning each other's rhythms, and slowly the cabin transformed from a shelter into a home. One evening, as they sat by the fire after a long day's work, Silas reached into his shirt and pulled out a small leather pouch Clara had never seen before. "I've been carrying this since Red Hollow," he said, opening it to reveal a simple gold band. "Bought it with the same gold I used to free you, thinking maybe someday, if you chose to stay, if I earned the right to ask." He stopped, searching for words. "I'm not good with pretty speeches, Clara, but I'm asking if you'll marry me. Not because it's expected or proper, or because I own you in any way, but because I love you and I want to spend whatever time we have building this life together." Clara looked at the ring, at this man who'd saved her and challenged her and ultimately freed her to become who she was meant to be. She thought about the girl who'd stood in the rusty nail being sold like livestock, about the woman who'd climbed cliffs and burned buildings and refused to quit. "Yes," she said simply, "not because you freed me from my father, not because you gave me shelter, but because you gave me the greatest gift anyone ever has. You let me be strong. You let me be myself. And I want to spend the rest of my life choosing you the way you chose to save me." Silas slipped the ring on her finger, and it fit perfectly, like it had been made for the hand of a woman who could split wood and stitch wounds and survive what should have killed her. They married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at Mary's cabin, with Mary officiating and the mountains as witness. There was no fancy dress, no crowd of well-wishers, no family blessing their union. Just two people who'd survived hell together, promising to face whatever came next as partners rather than survivors. The summer that followed was the happiest either of them had ever known. Clara's garden flourished in the high mountain soil, providing vegetables she preserved for the winter ahead. Silas's trap lines were productive, giving them furs to trade and meat to smoke. They worked hard, laughed often, and slowly built something that looked like a future. In August, a letter arrived via a trapper passing through. It was from her father, forwarded through Mary, and Clara almost threw it in the fire unread. But curiosity, or maybe the need for final closure, made her open it. The letter was brief, written in her father's shaky hand, and reeked of whiskey and regret. He was dying, he wrote. Liver giving out from years of drink. Wanted to apologize before the end. Wanted her to know he was sorry. Wanted forgiveness he knew he hadn't earned. Clara read it twice, felt the old anger and hurt rise up, then slowly let it go. Her father had made his choices, and she'd made hers. His regret couldn't undo the harm, but carrying rage couldn't heal the wounds either. She wrote back a single line. I forgive you, but I don't forget. Live what time you have better than you lived what's past. Then she sealed it and sent it with the next trapper heading to Red Hollow. She never heard from him again, and when word came 6 months later that Thomas Whitmore had died alone in his boarding house room, Clara felt only a distant sadness for what might have been if he'd been a different man. The first winter of their marriage was brutal, but beautiful. Clara was no longer afraid of the cold or the isolation or the hard work. She'd proven to herself that she could survive anything, and with Silas beside her, survival became something more. It became living. They talked by firelight about dreams and fears and futures. Silas opened up about the war, about the things he'd seen and done, about the guilt that had driven him into the mountains. Clara shared her own history of being dismissed and demeaned, of learning to be small so she wouldn't be noticed, of the rage that had burned inside her for years before finding an outlet. In sharing their damages, they found healing. Not complete, not perfect, but enough to build on. Spring came again, the third spring since Clara had left Red Hollow, and with it came a visitor. Marshal Crawford rode up to the cabin one April morning, and Clara's hand went instinctively to the rifle before she recognized him. Easy, Mrs. Boone, Crawford said, raising his hands peacefully. I'm not here for trouble, just closing out some paperwork. They invited him in, served him coffee, and waited to hear what business brought a federal marshal to their mountain. The investigation into Samuel Yates is officially concluded, Crawford said. Turns out he'd been running a lot more than a general store. Cattle rustling, claim jumping, extortion, even a few murders we can trace back to him. You two did the territory a service putting him down, even if it wasn't exactly by the book. We were defending ourselves, Silas said carefully. I know, and the law recognizes that now, officially. Which brings me to why I'm here. Crawford pulled out a legal document, unfolded it on the table. Yates's estate went to auction to pay his debts. No family stepped forward to claim it. Under territorial law, certain properties can be granted to homesteaders who've demonstrated productive use of the land. Your cabin and the surrounding 500 acres just got granted to you, free and clear. Congratulations. You own a mountain. Clara stared at the document, at the official seals and signatures that transformed their shelter into property, their survival into ownership. I don't understand. We didn't apply for this. No, but Mary Running Deer did on your behalf, and I supported the application. You've improved the land, built a sustainable homestead, proven you can thrive in conditions that would kill most folks. That's exactly what the Homestead Act was designed for. Crawford stood, preparing to leave. You're landowners now. That means responsibilities, but also rights. Nobody can force you off this mountain. It's yours. After he left, Clara and Silas sat in silence, processing what had just happened. They'd come to this mountain running from danger, seeking nothing more than survival. But they'd built something bigger than escape. They'd built a life, a home, a future that was now legally recognized and protected. We own a mountain, Clara said wonderingly. You own a mountain, Silas corrected. You're the one who transformed a hermit's cabin into a real home. You're the one who proved that strength comes in forms people don't expect. This is as much yours as mine. More, maybe. Clara looked around the cabin that had been her crucible and her sanctuary, at the man who'd been her unexpected salvation, at the life they'd built from nothing but determination and choice. Ours, she said firmly. Everything we've built, everything we've survived, everything we're going to become. It's ours together. That's what partnership means. As spring turned to summer and summer faded into fall, word of their story spread through the mountain communities. Other women who felt trapped in lives they didn't choose began to show up at their door, asking for advice, for help, for just the knowledge that escape was possible. Clara welcomed them, shared her story, offered what guidance she could, and sent them back into the world with the understanding that strength came from within, not from waiting for rescue. Some went back to their lives and found ways to change them from the inside. Some left for new territories and new beginnings. A few stayed in the mountains, building their own cabins and their own futures, creating a community of women who'd chosen freedom over comfort. Clara became something of a legend in the territory, the woman who'd been sold in a saloon and became a mountain pioneer, who'd burned down a corrupt man's empire and survived what should have killed her. Stories about her grew in the telling, some true, some exaggerated, but all carrying the same message: that women were stronger than the world wanted them to be, and that choosing your own life was worth any cost. 2 years after their marriage, on a cold February morning that reminded Clara of the night she'd left Red Hollow, she gave birth to a daughter in the cabin Silas had built to last. The labor was hard, attended only by Mary and Silas, and there were moments when Clara thought she might not survive it. But she'd survived everything else the mountain had thrown at her, and she'd be damned if childbirth would be what finally broke her. When she held her daughter for the first time, felt that tiny warm weight against her chest, Clara understood with perfect clarity what she'd been fighting for all along. Not just her own freedom, but the freedom to build something new, to create a life where her daughter would never know what it felt like to be sold or dismissed or told she was too much of the wrong things. They named her Sarah, after Silas's sister, the girl who'd died because no one had saved her. A remembrance and a promise that this child would grow up knowing she had choices, knowing she was strong, knowing that her worth was inherent and not determined by any man's valuation. As Clara held her daughter and looked out at the mountain that had become her kingdom, at the man who'd become her partner, at the life she'd built from ashes and determination, she understood that she'd finally become what she was always meant to be. Not the scared girl from the rusty nail. Not the woman men tried to buy and sell. Not even just a survivor, though she was certainly that. She was Clara Boone, mountain woman, landowner, mother, legend in the making. She was the woman who'd taken the worst hand life could deal and turned it into a winning gamble. She was the woman who'd proven that strength came in forms the world didn't recognize until forced to acknowledge them. She was free. And in that freedom, she'd built something that would last far longer than the mountains themselves, a legacy of choice, of strength, of refusing to be anything less than what she knew herself to be. Years later, when Sarah was old enough to understand, Clara told her the story of Red Hollow and the rusty nail and the night everything changed. She told her about being sold for $300 in gold, about the mountain recluse who offered freedom instead of ownership, about the brutal winter that forged her into someone new. She told her daughter about burning buildings and triggering rock slides, about climbing cliffs over certain death and carrying a dying man 5 miles through wilderness, about refusing to quit even when quitting would have been easier than breathing. And when Sarah asked why she'd done it all, why she'd risked everything for a future that wasn't guaranteed, Clara smiled and gave her the answer that had guided every choice since that night in the saloon. Because I learned that being free was worth any price. Because I discovered that strength isn't about being what others expect. It's about being true to what you know yourself to be. Because your father gave me a choice when no one else would, and I chose to become someone who made her own destiny. She looked out the cabin window at the mountain peaks touched with sunset gold, at the valley she and Silas had tamed without diminishing its wildness, at the life they'd built that stood as proof that two broken people could heal each other and build something beautiful from the wreckage. And because, Clara finished, pulling her daughter close, sometimes the best revenge against a world that tried to make you small is to become bigger than anyone imagined possible. To take what they said you couldn't do and make it look easy. To survive what should have killed you and come out the other side stronger than before. Sarah looked up at her mother with eyes that held the same fierce determination Clara saw in the mirror every morning, and Clara knew that the legacy would continue, that her daughter would grow up understanding that women could be strong and soft simultaneously, that size was irrelevant to worth, that the only chains that mattered were the ones you accepted. That night, as Clara lay beside Silas, listening to the wind trying futilely to shake a cabin built to last, she thought about the journey that had brought her here, about her father's betrayal and Yates's obsession and the mountain's brutal testing, about pain and fear and the moments when giving up would have been so much easier than continuing. And she thought about the woman she'd become, not despite those challenges, but because of them. Forged in fire and ice, tested by wilderness and violence, proven through survival and choice. She'd been sold in a saloon for $300 in gold, treated like property by men who couldn't see past their own greed and entitlement. But she'd bought herself back with blood and determination and an absolute refusal to be anything less than free. And in the end, she'd won something more valuable than gold, more lasting than revenge, more precious than any price could measure. She'd won herself, her strength, her choices, her life. And nobody, not her father, not Yates, not the world that tried to make her small, could ever take that away again. Clara Whitmore Boone, mountain woman and legend, closed her eyes and slept the sleep of someone who'd fought for everything she had and knew beyond doubt that she'd earned every bit of it. The mountain stood guard outside, eternal and unchanging. And inside the cabin built to last, a family slept safe and free and whole, their future written in choices rather than chains, their legacy measured in strength rather than submission. The woman they'd tried to sell had become the woman nobody could buy, and that made all the difference.